Tonight, the return of Jim Moseley. Jim is a pretty big man in the UFO department. Just returned from his trip. He was in Peru, right, Jim? Isabel Davis is with us. CSI, Civilian Saucer Intelligence. This is WOR Radio, your station in New York. Long John with the party line. Well, with Jim Moseley, Isabel Davis, Doug Dean, and Warren Park. We welcome you back, Jim.
Thank you very much, John.
And how was the trip?
Well, it was very interesting. I was down in Peru about a little over 2 months this time, and I had some very good luck in my amateur archaeology work. I believe I wrote you a note about it from down there. Is this the time to speak of that?
Why, certainly. You speak of anything you want at this time, but let's talk about that first.
Well, John...
But I want to just say this to you, that we hope a little later in the morning that we'll be able to discuss with you some of the statements, some of the articles that you printed in your publication, Saucer News, and in reference to Major Donald E. Kehoe, Director of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. I understand that whether you've done this yourself or whether some other people are involved or whether it's just an opinion, you seem to be a little concerned about the future of Nightcap. So we don't want to discuss that now. We want to know more about your trip to Peru.
Well, John, I always do a little amateur archaeology in Peru, and this year, or this fall, I was fortunate enough to be able to work with one of the regional museums in the southern coast, in the town of Ica. And we put in just a few days of work on one of the ranches or haciendas down there. And it happened by pure luck or pure accident that we found an item which I later learned was unique. That is to say that nothing of the sort had been dug up in Peru previously. The item came out of a Paracas tomb. A Paracas is one of the earliest cultures known in Peru. It dates from around the time of Christ, perhaps a couple of hundred years earlier, or perhaps 100 years or so later, but more or less the time of Christ. This particular tomb in which we found the unique object was a child's tomb at the depth of about 1 yard. And the item was this. It was a toy buried for the child in the tomb, and the toy was a miniature raft. The raft was a scale model of a large raft, the scale model being about 2.5 feet long and about 1/2 foot wide, roughly, and all done in miniature, exactly as a big raft would be. We found this item, we commented about it among ourselves, and although I was with a representative of the Ica Museum at the time, we honestly didn't realize at that time that nothing of the sort had been dug up in Peru previously. The item was donated to the Ica Museum, and later when I spoke to the director, he informed me of the importance of the find. The thing was published in the newspapers, and it became quite a big thing down there. Of course, the importance is this. As many of our listeners here probably know, a man named Thor Heyerdahl published a book called Kon-Tiki in about 1950, roughly. I'm not sure exactly the date. Following his journey on the raft, also called Kon-Tiki, from the port of Lima in Peru to the South Sea Islands. The purpose of this trip was to prove that trans-Pacific navigation was possible following the currents of the ocean, and he was trying to show that the ancient people of Peru might have done exactly as he did. He performed this successfully, this trip, and he wrote his book about it, but there was never any direct proof that the ancient people ever did this. In other words, just because he did it, it didn't mean that it had been done in the early times. Now, finally, this raft has been found, and if we can assume that if the raft exists in miniature, it also exists in full scale, then we finally have, in my opinion, quite a strong direct evidence that Thor Heyerdahl was right, and that there was a cultural exchange, quite possibly, between the South Sea Islands of the Pacific and Peru.
Go ahead, Isabel.
Has Mr. Hyatt been informed of this?
I understand that he's in Norway, and I doubt if it's gotten to his...
Shouldn't you let him know yourself? By the way, was it the same type of raft that he used?
Well, from my rather faint memory of the Kon-Tiki and other rafts that have set out from Peru since then, in the last few years, I think it's a very similar-looking object. I have a photograph of it here, and this not being television, I can't show it, but it does look very, very similar to the Hyadol raft.
Oh, I should think he would be tremendously excited.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, I went just today to the Museum of Natural History about this matter, where I talked to Dr. Junius Bird, who is the head of the South American section. That's not quite the proper title, but Dr. Bird, I believe it's fair to say, is the number one archaeologist in the country in regard to South American archaeology. And I showed him the photographs and told him this story, and he was quite impressed. He doesn't go as far as I do, or as far as some of the people in Peru went, in saying that this proves trans-Pacific navigation, but he does say that it is a very important find, and the first one of its kind found in Peru.
Jim, is there any way of deducing or figuring out from this toy that you found the actual dimensions of the original rafts, possibly?
Well, I wish I had gotten that more clearly today from Dr. Bird. I would assume from what he said that the dimensions of the actual raft were not too large. They were, I would say, about 25 feet by 10 feet. I hope I'm approximately right on that. And for that reason, he feels, being a little more conservative than I am perhaps on the matter, he feels that this particular raft in its full size was not large enough for anything more than coastal work, you might say. That perhaps they may have had bigger rafts in addition to this, but this particular one probably wouldn't have gotten across the Pacific, in his opinion.
Well, just to refresh my memory, what was the date that you gave to this toy, incidentally?
About the time of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And it was easy to date because the tomb in all other respects was a very typical one. I've done quite a lot of this work. And as I say, even though I'm only an amateur, I, of course, have reached the point where I recognize the pottery and the cloth that's found in a tomb, and this was a typical tomb of that particular period, similar to many others, the only difference being that this item was in it.
I see. Well, did you figure, or do you know whether this was, in what period of the Incas this was? Was this towards the peak of their civilization or towards their decline?
Did you say the Incas?
Yeah. I mean this...
Well, this is very much pre-Inca. The Incas came into power, roughly about 1000 AD or later. And again, my figures are probably quite a bit off, but it's much, much after this. And they fell from power, of course, at the time of the Spanish conquest. But this is about 1000 years before the Incas. This is one of the early pre-Inca groups.
Isabel?
Well, you know, in Hyatt's second book, Aku Aku, which came out recently and has aroused a great deal of interest, he has a number of other instances of things that seem to be carryovers from artifacts taken from Peruvian region, to Easter Island. And one of them has to do with another type of boat. There's a boat made of reeds, and these reeds grow in two places. They grow in Lake Titicaca in Peru. Were you there, by the way?
No, I haven't been up there. That's up in the mountains.
Well, they use them for fishing, and they're made entirely of a reed called a tutoro reed. And there are extinct volcanic craters on Easter Island, and in those craters, which are now filled with water, the same kind of reed grows, and the natives of Easter Island can still, a few of them, make this same type of boat. And they made a sample of it and went out fishing on it in the waters off Easter Island. That's another tie-in.
Well, that's very interesting. I think I recall Dr. Bird making some comment on that today, but he also pointed out this, which is quite important. I, incidentally, have read the series in the Saturday Evening Post by Thor Heyerdahl on the Aku Aku book. And I recall that no pottery was found at all in Easter Island, mainly stone stonework.
That is true. It's stone figures.
And so one of the arguments against this intercultural theory, I mean, mind you, I'm on the fence on this, you see, and one of the arguments against it is that every pre-Inca and Inca group in Peru had pottery of one sort or another, and yet none is found in Easter Island, and that is quite an important thing.
Wait a minute. There is something about pottery in that book, not in the sections that were published in the Saturday Evening Post. There are only 4 excerpts from it, you know. And but there is something. One of the natives, I believe, had either fragments or entire pots, only 4 or 5 of them. And I read the book only once, and I must go back and look at it. But I'm sure there's something there about pottery.
Weren't they pieces made by his grandfather or something in
they
fairly
may have
recent
been,
times?
Jim. I don't really remember.
I'm
not too accurate about that portion of the book.
I think that didn't go all the way back far enough, as I
No, it
recall.
may not have gone far enough back at all.
I think we've got to give Doug Dean a chance to get into this.
Well, I'll be very frank. Archaeology is not my meat at all. In fact, I'm frankly not interested in anything of the past particularly. I'm interested in the present. But one question would come to mind. It seems to me you're taking it for granted that this was a miniature of a large vessel. Couldn't it have been a miniature of a means of transportation to send the deceased person off to the happy hunting grounds, as happens in a lot of other cultures?
Well, I wouldn't think so. I would think of it, of course, this would be much more sensational, but if one were to find an airplane, for instance, or a flying saucer in a tomb, one would assume that the full-scale ones existed and for the purpose that we would, know of today. I know what you're speaking of. I think it refers more to Egypt. You mean the funeral sort of boat.
To put these little canoes. I remember reading.
I don't think that would apply here because this was a larger thing and more complex. It was for trips that would involve at least several days because, for instance, you have in the raft, you have a superstructure clearly shown, and underneath your superstructure is a compartment between the body of the raft and the superstructure itself. And in that, quite obviously, they had a storeroom for food and stuff like that. We found cotton, some sort of thing closely resembling cotton in there, which seemed to indicate that they were showing, or they were doing it, let's say, properly, imitating what they would do on the large-scale raft where they would put their food and their stores in that particular part.
Well, a few things that I've read about the Egyptian sarcophagus, is it? Is that how you pronounce it?
Well, that's out of my field, actually, Egypt.
I've read certain accounts where they've had actually full-scale canoes that were outfitted with food and all necessities to last the journey over to the hereafter.
I've heard that.
I think you're thinking of the solar ships that were dug up about 2 or 3 years ago. Those were full-scale ships. I think they found 2 of them. One created a terrific sensation. The second one not quite so much because it wasn't the first.
In fact, I remember it in Life magazine. They had the whole center cover.
Yes. Well, Jim, I really shouldn't get off of Peru, but because you used an expression a few sentences ago, you said that if you found a jet airplane in an Egyptian tomb, it would be a sensation. This exact comparison was used about a discovery of another kind recently. Did you happen to see about the mechanical model of the solar system?
Oh, yes.
Dated 65 BC that was found in the Mediterranean?
I read that article, yes, I remember, just the other day.
Terribly interesting. And the man who identified it in the Greek National Museum in Athens was a man named Dr. Derek Price of Cambridge, and who is also in this country working at the Institute of Advanced Studies. And he said that this was like finding a jet airplane in King Tut's tomb.
I think that's why I used the comparison, because it was in my subconscious from having read that particular article.
What part of Peru was this?
This is in the southern coast. It's not really coast in that it's not very close to the ocean. I would say it would be about at least 30 miles, perhaps up as far as 50 miles from the ocean, but it's considered coast because coast, in the sense that they use it, goes all the way to the Andes, which divides the coast from the jungle.
Isn't it amazing to find something like this, which is almost 2,000 years old or possibly older, so close to the surface?
Well, no, because the tombs in Peru are very often only about 3 feet deep, which is what this one was. You find generally that the poorer tombs, the tombs of the poorer people, are close to the surface. Some tombs are as deep as 20 or 30 feet. I've found both extremes at one time or another in my diggings. But for a thing to be close to the surface, no, it's not unusual. I've even found quite valuable items just 2 or 3 feet sometimes beneath the surface.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Isn't that partly because it's so dry there in the coastal region?
No, the depth wouldn't have anything to do with that. The preservation of the items, of course, is related to the depth, but I would say that it was just their custom when they had something particularly valuable, and of course the wrath was not something that they considered valuable, but I speak of gold and the more things that we today would think of as obviously valuable. Those things they wanted to place far down for one reason or another.
Did they have any kind of protection? I mean, such as any religious implications, such as curses like we had in Egypt and so on?
I wouldn't know. I mean, of course, anything like that was probably lost at the time of the conquest. Today, there's very little superstition about the tombs, and if that existed, it's been lost. Before we go off of this and this business of Peru, that is, I'd like to get in one other thing because it relates to a thing I discussed the last time I was on the program, which was several months ago. The listeners who heard me that time will remember, I hope, that I was talking about a Chinese mummy that I also discovered in Peru. This I didn't dig up.
Chinese?
Well, I say Chinese because I abbreviated a little bit too much there. What it was a typical Peruvian mummy with a 4-piece or a headband around the forehead. And on this headband were 4 Chinese characters, or I again am a little bit wrong. I should say Oriental characters because they haven't been definitely identified as Chinese. And this, of course, was a very sensational thing. I found it by accident in someone's home. It had been dug up about 60 years ago. And it had been sort of lost to public knowledge, hidden away in this fellow's basement, so to speak. And no one had paid any attention to it. It wasn't written up in any of the books on archaeology down there. It was not known to the museum in Lima or to any of the present-day archaeologists. And I found it by accident, photographed it, and became quite interested in it because, of course, if it were pre-Columbian, and by that I mean of the era before the Spanish conquest, then it would prove, if genuine, of course, it would prove that there was a migration of some sort from the Orient to the west coast of South America. The reason I bring it up again now is because I did some more investigation on that, and I find now, in my opinion at least, that the mummy with this Chinese writing on it, or Oriental writing, although genuine, is not from the pre-conquest period. It apparently is from the colonial period, after the conquest, and therefore is not of any great archaeological importance. In other words, it would involve perhaps some Chinese that came over in the 17th or 18th century, went up into the hitherlands of Peru and were buried in the old manner of mummification, and just happened to have this writing on the forehead.
You say that you have you've changed the dating, the assumed dating on this. Would you mind telling us a little about how you happened to move it forward in time?
Well, the first time I saw the mummy and took pictures of it and then came on this program and talked about it, I hadn't examined it thoroughly. Actually, while I was up here that time, I tried to interest some of the museums here in the thing, and, well, didn't get too far with it, but when I got back down to Peru again this last time, I took another look at the mummy myself, and I thought perhaps I could get further with it. And the clue that gave it away was something that is not, let's say, too obvious or too obscure to a person who's done a little studying of Peruvian archaeology, and it was this. Among the various things around the head and the neck of the mummy were several necklaces of little gold beads and little beads made of bone and one thing or another, which are very common on most mummies that are found down there. But among other things were little pieces of colored glass. And I found these myself in several tombs. And these colored glass objects are invariably after the conquest. And that is always called I believe they call it a contact tomb in archaeology when they find that. That means that it's a tomb of the Inca period, the last period before the conquest, but it was after contact was made, because it would mean that the Spanish arrived in that area and gave little beads to the Indians, trading, much as went on at one time in this country. And then the people, burying their dead in the same old way, would just include these little beads in the stuff that they would put in the tomb, you see.
Does this mean that the Incas did not have glass blowing?
They didn't have glass. They didn't have glass at all, so any glass has to be from somewhere.
Doug, I see in this very interesting picture you have here, Jim, of the mummy's head. Does that attach to the whole body?
That's right. It's still complete.
My first question is going to be, is this just a little toy size? Because it looks like a little kind of a Haitian or the voodoo type mummy, when you first look at it.
No, this is a full-size man. Unfortunately, I don't have any of my other pictures here. You would see that it's a full-size body, but somewhat shrunken by mummification, and also in a sort of a not extended position. What would you call it? With the knees bent, you see, and therefore not taking up more than about 3 feet in length. But it's a full-size person. One interesting feature is the feathers in the top. I know nothing about archaeology, as I said before. Do feathers stay in a feather shape? Yes, they have a tendency to disintegrate more rapidly than some other things would, but quite often you find feathers. Those would be from certain birds down there that have colorful feathers, and they're very often put in as a headdress on a mummy, and they sometimes stay that way, and sometimes they're even found in a piece of clothing, a piece of cloth you'll find with feathers attached all over it in the form of a design, sometimes even the form of a human or animal figure, very, very beautifully done and still complete after 1,000 years.
Not getting off the subject, the reason I asked the question is because I'm an archer, and one of my hobbies, and they have yet to discover a feather for an arrow that is not the real one. They've tried all sorts of plastics and makeshift feathers, but the real ostrich feathers and some other types of feathers are the only ones that really stand up to the terrific beating that they take.
Well, everything on this mummy, as I say, was quite common. Even the little beads that I spoke of, the glass beads. But the thing, of course, that makes it interesting and uncommon is the Oriental writing. I still have to find someone who can translate that, and I probably won't find anyone, because there are hundreds of Chinese dialects even today, and if you take a dialect that existed 200 or 300 years ago, which again could be any of hundreds, it would be quite a problem. And I understand that Chinese changed radically just about around that time, and that the modern Chinese is quite different from the old. And then again, it could be Japanese, it could be something else. So I don't know who I'm going to find on that.
Well, I have a friend that might possibly be able to help you. She's a sinologist. She's works in the Oriental Division of the Brooklyn Museum, and I must certainly let her know. Because the Chinese kept very elaborate records, Their historical documents were simply enormous way back, and there have been, if you were trying to write a complete history of China, you'd have the most terrific mass of information and data from Chinese records themselves.
Well, it seems to me, as I say, that in the post-conquest period, quite possibly that there were traders or something that came from the Orient, and that is interesting, and would be interesting if it could be proven, but it's not as exciting as it was to think that it was a pre-conquest item. Then that would be, of course, even more sensational than this raft.
Jim, getting back to the original tomb, the other one, the one where you found the raft with the toy, this race, what happened to them? Are there any records?
Well, you see, no Peruvian culture at any time, including the Incas, ever had any written language. And the study of South American archaeology today is purely the study of the evidences left behind on the pottery, on the cloth, and on one thing or another. It's all indirect evidence. They know that there were wars between these different tribes. They know that several before the Incas conquered each other, and so on. You find influence of one culture of the same period, let's say, of the north of the country, let's say, in a tomb in the south. You know from that, if you study it carefully, more or less what was going on. But the complete history is just lost and may never be found.
How far back do they estimate that this race goes? Is there any way of figuring this out?
Well, the earliest ones they know about, and again I'm a little hazy, but I'd say 2,000 or 3,000 B.C. would be the earliest that they've discovered. You know, with the carbon-14 today, the carbon-14 test, they can get further than they used to. I'm giving these ages, but they're still not exact, really.
Go ahead, Isabel.
Without any, without any signs of any communication at all in a culture like this, might be an interesting thought that they use mental telepathy.
Well, they may have.
That they even wrote or
I'm afraid my friends in the museum would be rather horrified to hear you say that, but I'm certainly open to the thought. If anyone has any evidence for it, I don't know.
Well, didn't they communicate by means of these knotted cords? And don't I remember Von Hagen here saying that they were accustomed to convey quite elaborate messages, and they're not able to read these knotted cords completely. In some cases, of course, they would be just arithmetical records or bookkeeping records, so to speak.
No, Isabel, you're a little wrong on that, and it's a very interesting point. I was going to mention that the knotted cords, which have a particular name in Quechua, in the Indian language down there, and the name escapes me, but they're only in regard to numbers, records of the number of cows or the number of this or that in a particular district. It seems hard for me to imagine that a group like the Incas that developed numbers, let's say, written down in a certain way, didn't develop a written language of messages. The messages were not written down, only the numbers. And it's hard, it's hard to imagine that was true, and I, again speaking in my own personal opinion, am waiting or hoping for the day that they'll find some hieroglyphics down there, because it seems quite possible.
John, if I may just digress from the conversation at the moment, which is highly interesting, wasn't the first 25 minutes or so of the program on tape this morning, your discussion of last night's program, John? The first 25 minutes were on tape this morning, weren't they?
No. Oh, you mean we have it on tape now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We have it on tape now.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, for the benefit of people who, tune in later, or, some people perhaps might be working for 1 or 2 o'clock, that you might consider replaying the tape later on, maybe during the coffee break or something like that.
Well,
we're swamped with telegrams here.
May I say this to you? I don't want to say that you haven't got an original idea, but Al Nielsen told me that there were a few phone calls. Naturally, we have no connection with the switchboard operator. In other words, the operator cannot put an outside call connected up to the engineer's booth. And I understand some people heard 3 or 4 minutes of it, and some people didn't hear it, but friends of theirs called and all like that. Naturally, everything that we do is taped, and then we erase it the following night. Let me ask Al Nielsen, do we have that little opening comment? Is that on tape? Did you tape all of that? You did? Well, we have it, and there'd be no way of editing. We'd have to start with good morning, and,
Well, you could mention ahead of time that it was on tape, perhaps, so we wouldn't interfere with the conversations with Mr. Moseley and the other guests, that we could put it on during the coffee break so that people could hear it, and at the same time we wouldn't interrupt the program, actually.
That's a good idea. We'll try it out during the coffee break. Of course, in a couple of minutes we'll get some telegrams saying don't do it, but we'll find out. We have a lot of telegrams. We'll certainly acknowledge those after a little while, but I know that all of our listeners will certainly be interested in hearing more from Jim Moseley. Did I interrupt you before, Isabel?
Oh,
I'm sorry, I had to take care of business.
Surely, that's all right. I'm just saving up about 19 more questions for Jim. I want to know if there's any more information about the famous lines at Nazca.
Oh,
that
yes.
you wrote the article about.
Well, I also...
maybe some people haven't heard about it, Jim.
That's right, I discussed it a little bit on the same program where I was discussing the mummy with the Oriental writing. I planned to do some investigating on my own of the same lines during this trip to Peru, and I did do just that. I had some theories about the lines. I've read the booklet put out by a English archaeologist named Maria Wright, which is not very well known in this country, although I believe it was reprinted in part in National Geographic a few years ago.
It was reprinted somewhere, but I don't remember where.
I'm not sure now if it was National Geographic. I have distributed a few of these booklets through my magazine from time to time as I've been able to get them. But generally it's not known up here. In fact, the whole subject of the Nazca lines isn't known. Briefly, the lines consist of marks on the desert, in the Nazca Desert, which is, again, near Ica, the same place where I was hunting with the Ica Museum and found this little raft. In that same general area, there is, I'd say, several hundred square miles, actually, of the desert, which is just devoted to most peculiar lines. Now, these lines are made in the following way. The actual desert is sort of a reddish-colored rock. It's a rock with a lot of iron in it, and the whole desert is just flat with these rocks on it. And the ancient people, whoever they were, for some reason which is still unknown, made perfectly straight lines by a simple method of moving these rocks to one side and leaving the white sand underneath the lines exposed. So without raising anything, without building anything, the last time I discussed this, a lot of people on the panel asked me how this was done, and is it some sort of ridge or something? It isn't. It's just a matter of moving away these red-colored rocks and leaving the white sand exposed. And by doing that, these lines stand out. Even today, after hundreds and hundreds of years, they stand out quite plainly and are quite visible. Some run for several miles. Some run for only a few hundred yards. Some, instead of being lines, are in the form of figures of animals, birds, and so on. And some of these figures are several hundred yards in their various dimensions. It's really quite a peculiar layout, and as yet, no one who has studied it has reached the bottom of it as to who built it or why. Why, of course, is the most important question. Now, I haven't solved this either, and I honestly don't think I'm even qualified because this lady I mentioned, this Maria Wright, has spent 15 years studying these lines. She's mapped them. She's spent days at a time camping out there, which is quite a feat. I've tried it. And it's a terrible area with winds and hot sun all year round. And she hasn't reached the bottom of it. The lines run in every conceivable direction, every sort of angle, and they cross each other in some places. Some of the intersections are planned. Some of them seem to be accidental. It's all very confused. My little idea was simply to try the most obvious thing, to hunt in the intersections of the lines to see if they might contain tombs. Because in other areas of the world, including here in the United States, tombs of Indians have been found at the intersections of lines. I refer to the Mound Indians in the Middle West here.
Oh, I hadn't heard that.
And the Mound Indians built their mounds, their artificial mounds, with their graves in the mound, not underneath the ground, but in the mound raised above the ground. And they had lines leading to the mound. And I hear from friends of mine and from a little studying I've done that similar situations have been found in Egypt and elsewhere. And the situation in Egypt led to quite a large treasure being found at the intersection of these particular lines. So based on this, I was quite interested to see what might be at the intersection of these Nazca lines. And I can tell you at this time that there's nothing at the intersection of the Nazca lines.
Jim, may I get in here to maybe change the subject a little bit, since John did mention that you are editor of the Source of News? I think we perhaps should start at the beginning just a little bit for the benefit of those who haven't heard you before. And so suppose I give you a nice broad general question to start it out and ask you, Jim Moseley, how did you first become involved in saucer work?
Oh, that is a little hard to answer. I was interested in saucers from the time of Kenneth Arnold at the very beginning in 1947, although I was just a kid at that time. But I became much more interested, I'd say, after the 1952 wave of sightings, and I started doing some investigation on my own. I met a writer with whom at the time I planned to do a book, and it didn't work out, but I went on my own. And finally, in 1954, I reached the point where I had enough contacts in the field of other saucer researchers that I thought that I could begin a magazine, and I began this I have been doing it ever since.
I'd like to ask you something, Jim, before I turn over to the other people. Why are there so many different saucer organizations? There seem to be an unusual number.
Well, there again, there's no simple answer. I, being a little bit cynical perhaps, would answer you this way, that I think that in the field of saucer research there's a bit of egotism, and I think people prefer to lead than to follow. Therefore, every person who has a few ideas or a little mimeograph machine puts out his own publication and seeks readers rather than, let's say, joining another organization that's already established where perhaps he could do more good. But because of that element of egotism, or whatever you might call it, there are actually dozens and dozens of publications, some good, bad, and indifferent, and they just come and go. I mean, they usually last a year or so, and then they fade out.
I happen to have read a very bad one. It happens to be in book form. I think you mentioned it here, UFO Confidential by Mr. Williamson.
Oh, that in my opinion was one of the worst.
I was amazed. I don't want to start a hate show this morning, but I was amazed to find a little anti-Semitic business in this book also.
Well, yes, there is, now that you mention it, and I mentioned it also in my book review.
Yes, I noticed you did.
The thing that you bring up is this: there's a gentleman named William Dudley Pelley, who used to be associated with anti-Semitic organizations before World War II. And I'm not being libelous in saying this because it's a matter of record, he was in jail for 7.5 years for sedition from approximately 42 to 1949. And after getting out, he reorganized himself in an organization called Soulcraft, which has its headquarters in Noblesville, Indiana. And at the beginning, he was apparently only interested in politics and spiritualistic matters. Mm-hmm. By that I mean mediums and spiritualism from that point of view, or from that interpretation. Finally, as saucers got hot, so to speak, he enlarged his scope to include not only spiritualism and politics, but he got into saucers to a small extent for a year or two. And during that time, he had George Williamson on his staff.
Oh, I see.
And George Williamson is a follower of Adamski. It's actually more complicated than that, but briefly you can say that he's of the Adamski school. And after he broke with Pelley 2 or 3 years ago, he went off on his own, and he's written several books. But my comment here was that he seems to be still under the influence of Pelley, because I find in his book a lot of references to things such as the international bankers, which is a vague term describing something that I don't even understand, but it has to do with that line of thought.
And as the only person sitting around the table right now outside of John who is not involved with saucers in any way, I mean, Doug, as he'll probably tell you later, has seen a saucer. I'll be asking several questions that are possibly very elemental, but you'll forgive me. You call this the saucer news, and yet you also have unexplained celestial events. I mean, you mentioned the society here. Do you feel that there are flying saucers, and if so, what are they? In other words, you don't say they're all UFOs are necessarily, excuse me, that's a tough word tonight, flying saucers. I mean, are they definitely, in your opinion, craft from outer space, or whatever you want to call it?
Well, the point on which I have differed with most of the other researchers is that I feel that after you explain the approximately 90% that are mistakes of various sorts, including a few hoaxes, but not too
Where do
many.
you get this 90%, Mr. Moseley?
I would certainly not.
90%
I would not.
mistakes?
I would not. Well, I was going to say, including everything, your mistakes, your hoaxes,
Well, Jim is
your illusions,
making his opinion. I don't think that's fair.
your data mental type of things, which do also exist. I would say that you don't have certainly more than 10% of the total number of sightings that are worth considering.
I think what you're taking is the attitude that the 90% is what the Army, the Air Force has derived from this, from people like Menzel who have come out and said that they're balloons and meteors and everything else. This is an Air Force assumption. That it's
Oh, no, the
90%.
Air Force does not agree with Dr. Menzel, and Dr. Menzel...
Well, they certainly did on the Armstrong Circle Theater.
Well, this is, Ruppelt mentions this. He says that this is one of the things that, one of the theories that Project Blue Book, when he was the head of it, investigated very thoroughly, and one of the things that they just did not accept is that these things were mirages.
Jim?
Armstrong Circle Theater of the Air, you know, was a very peculiar program in many ways. And although Menzel spoke on it, nevertheless, he himself has felt, he says so in his book, that the Air Force has thoroughly neglected his theories, his meteorological theories about saucers. No, excuse me, Warren, but this question of percentages is quite important because for the Air
Let's let
Force...
Jim make his statements first, and then we'll give you your chance to disagree. Jim, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say about the percentage figure there, I don't feel it's too important. You can call it 80% or 70 or 90 or 95 because scientifically, and this being a scientific mystery, we try to think of it in a scientific manner, it would only take one proven and valid case of a flying saucer to prove the whole point. And statistics don't do much good. I mean, piling sighting upon sighting, at least for the past 10 years of research, hasn't done anything yet to solve the matter. I think it's a question of a few good sightings, and it wouldn't make much difference how few, rather than the vast majority of sightings which either are not close enough to give any detail or which can be solved in conventional manners.
Well, do you actually contend that there is not even one good, absolutely solid sighting?
I'm not saying that, but I would say that to date we perhaps have about 100 or so. I know that Justin Case, who writes for my magazine, he always says that there are about 40. I think he's wrong. I'd say at least 100, but perhaps there'd be 200, but there's not an awful lot. I mean, I refer to the ones now where the saucer is seen within 100 feet or so, because I feel, and several of my contributors have also expressed this in articles, that a person, especially an untrained observer, seeing an object at a great distance, even several hundred yards, and more so when you get into miles into the sky, just cannot be sure, cannot state accurately either the size or the speed of the object. You have the color, the type of motion that it's doing. Those things can be expressed accurately by anyone. You have the angular velocity, which can be expressed accurately if a person knows what that is and can describe it. But certainly not the most important things of all, the size and the speed, because that's where you get down to the question of whether it is really unconventional or not.
Well, that's very true, but the most important point of all about the behavior of these things is their maneuvers and their maneuverability and the extraordinary accelerations that they perform.
But that's
well, I'll take your figure of 100 if you like, but I'm personally convinced there are many more than that. But size and speed don't affect the question of maneuvers, rapidity, and of change of direction, and so on. What do you do, for instance, about the Nash-Fortenberry case?
Well, that would be one of the better ones. I don't like it as much as, I mean, this is my personal feeling, I don't like it as much as one like the Fitzgerald case, which was, as you probably know, last September, where the lady saw the saucer right on her lawn,
Yes.
And although Nash and Fontenberry were pilots of Pan American Airlines, and they were, in a sense, qualified observers, yet I would prefer Mrs. Fitzgerald's sighting, because although she was an untrained person, she saw the thing so close that it would be very, very difficult for her to make any sort of a mistake of importance. She still might be wrong on the size. I see several different quotes, as a matter of fact, in different newspaper versions, from 8 feet up to 20 feet, but it just wouldn't make that much difference at that distance, you see, whereas Nash and Fontenberry described the maneuvers, but they didn't or couldn't have known the size accurately, I would say.
It's the maneuvers that are the significant thing in that case. I don't think that the sizes, after all, the objects were below them. There were certain limitations on the size because they knew their own altitude above the ground, and the saucers were below them.
Well, I think at that time what people were trying to establish, more so than now, is whether the saucers were subjects or some sort of reflections. And the important thing about that sighting, as I recall it, was that they were above the saucers, and the saucers were seen at a lower altitude than they were, and that seemed to eliminate the possibility of reflections and so on.
Also, there were confirming reports. There were 7 confirming reports that night.
Oh, well, there's no doubt that they saw something, but the point is, if you don't know the distance away, the maneuvers are not confirmed in detail. In other words, a maneuver may appear to be right angle when it's observed at a great distance, and yet it isn't precisely right angle. But if you were close up, you would see that it is a steep bank or a steep curve.
Isabel?
Well, in this particular case, Jim, you can't raise that objection because the angle was much sharper. It was a very much more acute angle. In fact, they used the expression that these 6 objects, then they were later joined by 2 almost immediately. It was like bouncing a tennis ball off a wall. Now, this is not the distance away, whatever the altitude was, and I'm sorry to say I don't remember their altitude at the time. It isn't going to make that much difference in what they see directly underneath them.
Well, I would say that it's one of the better sightings, but again, just in my personal opinion, I like the very close ones better. And there are only, just 2 or 3 dozen of those. About 12 were treated in that Air Force Project Blue Book number 14, and there have been quite a few that they overlooked, but there's not an awful lot.
What about all the hundreds and probably thousands of people that have never come out and made the statements that they've seen them? And I know of many of them.
Oh, there are, but I say, out of the thousands and thousands that have made the statement that they've seen them, many of those people were wrong, and many people were probably not wrong, but you can't prove it because the description is too vague. It lacks detail, and you just can't prove a thing scientifically except by a very close observation. And when you're talking about an unknown object such as this, even observation in itself is hardly enough. That's why scientists still hold back on this, because there's no still picture, which is beyond dispute. There's 2 movies, of course, of UFOs, but they are
Can you tell me? I'm not familiar with the 2 movies.
Well, 2 film clips, I should say, that were shown in the movie called UFO, the commercial picture.
I'm familiar with those.
And they are good. They're not faked, or no one claims they are, but then they're not beyond dispute because the objects are at such a distance away that you can't say too much about them. I mean, that's been argued back and forth for a long time. I'm just saying that the thing is still up in the air in a certain sense. There's no solution yet, Isabel, or else we'd all be out of business.
Don't you think that we're going about this whole source of story in a completely wrong attitude? I think so myself. I think we rely on so-called scientific judgments. You made the statement a few minutes ago that untrained personnel. I would like to ask you a question, Jim. What is a trained or an untrained person having a sighting? How do you determine this?
Well, we had
this is something supposedly out of space. So who's to judge who is trained and who isn't?
Well, we had a discussion about that very point on this program one night, and it came down to this point. What is a trained flying saucer observer? Well, there's no such thing, because you can be a trained observer, and yet a trained flying saucer observer would imply that you see them every day or something, and finally you get it down to a science, and no one sees them that often except possibly a Damsky or someone. And so therefore it's out of the realm of experience of even the most trained observer in a certain sense. I remember I talked personally to Clyde Tombaugh, the astronomer, whose sighting is, I'd say, in the 100 that I mentioned, of being among the best. Not so much because he was a so-called trained observer, but because the thing passed quite low over his home, and he looked at it quite carefully. And yet he expressed to me the feeling, which may or may not have been in his published statements, that as trained as he is and as scientific as he is or tries to be, and as much as he's done in the field of science, he was so startled, and there was something so far out of his knowledge and experience that he, for a while, forgot to be objective and forgot to sort of, look at the size and the shape and the color and everything, and he just was sort of overcome, and it was later that he started to analyze the whole thing. And there's a good example of a man who is a trained observer, if anyone can be called that, and even he was not accurate in his description. He was as accurate as he could be, and yet perhaps an untrained person might have done as well. I mean, in that he got excited, you see.
But Jim, there are a number of cases in which these things have been under observation for prolonged periods. Half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, and been watched for that length of time, even from the air. And you have to say that in that length of time, the observer, especially if he's an airline pilot, makes his living in the air, works there, is constantly engaged in watching things, is certainly relatively competent to evaluate, observe, make notes, and so forth.
Well, most of those sightings have been at a great distance. I can't recall one of the very good ones that took that long.
There was the one where I didn't mean to butt in, but there was the one where the airline pilot left New York City to fly to Buffalo. I think it was in the nightcap, what's the name? The
UFO investigator.
UFO investigator about 4 or 5 months ago, and it was supposed to be a big case in CAA over it, because the Air Force commanded the pilot to go chase the thing with all the passengers aboard.
Well, I don't say that there haven't been any good sightings, including perhaps some airline sightings. I just say that the vast majority of sightings are overrated, in my opinion. And I've had a technical man, as I say, or as I indicated earlier, write 1 or 2 articles for me expressing the thing perhaps better than I can as to how people can be fooled in regard to things like size and distance, and they don't realize it. And they'll make statements in the newspaper like the thing was the size of a football, it was the size of a penny or something, or it was the size of a marble, or the size of a house, or anything, and they don't know what they're saying because there's nothing to refer it to. They see a thing by itself in the sky. It can be making any maneuver you like, but they just don't know the distance or the size, and they just guess wildly. Some of their guesses are quite far from the truth, probably.
I would like to ask all 3 of you one question. And although I've talked to all of you as individuals and at different times on the program, I think it's the first time that the 3 of you have been together. I'm not referring to Warren Pat, but I know that you're very interested in flying saucers, Isabel, and I know that you are, Doug, and also Jim. And I would like to present this question. Why are you interested in flying saucers? And you might answer that, Isabel, and possibly elaborate on it and even discuss some of your other feelings about them.
Yes. Well, I became interested in astronomy along about 1941. I took a course in astronomy, an evening course in astronomy at Columbia University. And then I was in San Francisco in 1947 at the time that the Kenneth Arnold story broke. And if I had dreamed at that time how persistent this phenomenon was going to be and how deeply interested I was going to become, I think I would have bought up every newspaper on the West Coast at that time and saved the clippings because they're simply full of extraordinary cases. And this was before the scoffers and the debunkers and the hoaxes and the jokesters got to work. And then I, of course, followed it somewhat in the years after that, culminating in 52, which was, of course, our big year. 54 was bigger, probably, in Europe than 52 was here. Well, I'm interested in it, Don, because I can't see why people aren't interested in it. If I can turn your question into reverse. It's very curious to me. The real puzzle in this whole subject to me is why is there so much resistance to the idea of our having been visited by extraterrestrial intelligences? We've noticed, I think, all of us, in recent months, how many scientists have come out with a statement that there is a possibility of intelligent life on other worlds. They're willing to admit that possibility. Even Dr. Menzel does. But the fact and the possibility that we make contact with other intelligences. But the possibility that we already have been, I don't like that word contact, it's a dirty word in my vocabulary, but that we already have been visited by intelligences from other worlds, this sticks in their craw. This they can't take. And why they can't make that one step, I just can't figure out. I think there are very deep-seated resistances to the idea. I think some of it is fear. I think that it may possibly be that Dr. Menzel unconsciously is afraid of the subject, because in his book on saucers, I once counted up the number of times he uses terms like frightened or scared or panicked, and I think it's something like 84 times through the book as a whole. To me, this possibility doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I find it very interesting, and I'm really at a loss to understand why there's so much resistance to the idea.
Well, Jim, you go ahead with the same question, and if you want to answer that, I'd like to get in for a moment after that. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say I'm in a different camp, perhaps. I'm fascinated by the idea of life on other worlds, and I'm interested in science fiction. I'm very much interested in saucers, more so than in science fiction. But although I certainly believe, as the scientists have stated, that there, in all probability, is life on other worlds, I don't see, frankly, in this sighting wave that we're having now and have had for the past several years, I don't see the characteristics of what I would call a visitation from another planet. Now, it's conceivable and it's possible, but it just doesn't have the characteristics to me, and that's why I don't accept it as being
Well,
there.
now, you better explain what you mean when you say the characteristics of a visitation. You mean they don't behave as you think that visitors from another planet ought to behave?
Well, it's not the way they ought to behave. It would be, one aspect of it would be this. It's very peculiar, as I pointed out at several different times, I think in my magazine and perhaps on the air. It's peculiar how this thing goes, that you never have a close sighting over a populated area. You never have a photograph that's close enough to prove anything. You never have a landing in Times Square to be crude. You never have any of these things that would prove the matter, and yet this has gone on for years and years. There seems to be a pattern. Now, it could be that the space people don't want to frighten us and so on, and they only want to observe and not bother our civilization too much. But it would seem to me that more likely they would be indifferent. If they were indifferent, then they would show up more at close range, and the thing would be pretty well settled by now. Or again, they might not be indifferent, they might want to interfere in human affairs, and then of course we'd know about it. The way this has gone, it seems to me more like a type of object, or I should say the saucers are a type of object that doesn't want to be seen at close range, and that makes it more earthly, in my opinion.
Doug, thanks for reading the telegrams, and now the question. Why are you interested in flying saucers? And I present this question to you as well as to Isabel and to Jim, because I know that
I think all three of you are certainly more interested in the subject than the average guy on the street. I mean, he may talk about it for a little while, and that's the end of it. But you put in a lot of valuable time talking with people, interviewing people. You spent a lot of time out in New Jersey and different places, and I'd like your opinion and an answer to the question.
Well, as far as interest now, my interest has waned on the whole flying saucer situation. And I have to say it in this way. I had my first sighting way back in 1947. I had 12 of them since then. And last January 1st, I was instrumental in helping to start an organization called NICEB, which over a period of about 5 months, I put in practically 24 hours a day.
Doug, pardon me just 1 second. Just for the benefit of we poor laymen, would you explain what that last abbreviation
New York Saucer Information Bureau.
Thank you.
I resigned from the directorship about 3 months ago, and the reason I resigned was because I had conclusively formed the opinion, and this is my own personal opinion, that the flying saucers exist and are here. And they are not from this earth. I believe, I won't say it, I believe, I will say that I accept the fact that they are here. I know.
Doug. I heard
well, I'm in the habit, form, condition way of thinking, and it's quite a job to get out of the habits of speech, because I don't like the word believe. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, the whole flying saucer situation did something for me, and if their mission was to bring out a more spiritual thinking or level of the people of the world, they've accomplished it as far as I'm concerned, because this is my goal from now on. I won't say that I'm not interested anymore in flying saucers. I will say that I am not interested in sightings and going through all the long rigmaroles and papers and everything else, and this scientist said this and this scientist said that. As I say, I have conclusively come to the opinion that they exist, and from what I've seen myself, I've never gone to any of the big authorities and made reports on my sightings, because as far as I'm concerned, these men are no more qualified to tell me that I didn't see something or I did see something. And I've met an awful lot of people in the last year that have come to this conclusion, and this is one of the reasons why they just refuse to go to the authorities on sightings. I think this probably states my opinion. Not that I'll talk about it, but my whole heart now is an entirely different goal, and both my wife and I have, I think you know by this time now, Warren, we've both been in yoga now, for studying yoga for the last year.
Mm-hmm. Jim,
and it's changed our whole way of thinking.
I think Jim looked like he wanted to comment on
Well, I was just going to answer the same question. My answer can be very brief. I'm attracted to and interested in everything which is on the fringe of man's knowledge, everything that's somewhat mysterious. Our science, I think, has reached the point where most things are known and understood, well, I wouldn't even say most things, but a great many things, and yet there are these unusual occurrences. I don't mean only saucers, there's monsters, and there's ESP, and there's many, many things that are not fully understood, and which are worth investigating and learning more about, and somehow I'm just attracted by this type of thing and want to learn more about them. That's my answer.
Well, there I would agree with you, too. Saucers aren't the only thing that's interesting. There's all the range of Fortean phenomena and so-called psychic phenomena, and it's all more or less neglected. But, Jim, may I say just two things very briefly about your previous comment? If I understand you correctly, you're saying that your belief in the extraterrestrial theory, your acceptance of it, is hindered by the inconclusive nature of the evidence. Of course, I don't think the evidence is inconclusive at all. I think it's quite conclusive. However, may I remind you of two things, and one is that there are, of course, cases where upon investigation, the observer appears not to know nearly as much as he seemed to know at first. He says he saw something the size of a football, and it's obvious he couldn't have told what the size was at all. On the other hand, there are also cases that upon investigation become stronger instead of weaker. And I could name 2 or 3 of those, except that I don't want to take the time. And I think that some of the others, if we were investigating them properly, the same thing might happen. You might add to your strong cases instead of deducting from the total number. And also, Jim, don't forget that we have never had in this country a scientific investigation of this subject. The Air Force investigation is not scientific. Whatever they say, it is laughably unscientific. And if we had gone into this subject and really given it careful, serious study without laughing at it, without brushing it off, without belittling it and scoffing at it, we might have some of the answers that you are looking for.
Let me get in ahead of you just for a moment, Jim. Having taken a stand on racialism, on whether dogs should be cut up or not, I feel that I can certainly take a stand on flying saucers. When my friend Doug Dean says that he saw what he thought was a flying saucer, I would believe Doug because I know Doug, a man of integrity. I also had the chance to speak to people that I might add, like George Van Tassel, who had somebody climb down a carpet and talk to him right at his bedside on Giant Rock Airport, who I don't believe. I've had opportunity to talk to other people who I won't identify because I think these people, at least, I'm not including George in them, are pure frauds. And I think that we have a great amount of frauds in this field. I will say this, as far as I am concerned, nobody asked me my opinion, of course, but I'll put it in anyhow.
I'll ask you.
Well, thank you, Doug. I believe there are such things as unidentified flying objects. I believe there is a possibility of life on other planets. And beyond that, I will not go. There are certain things that stick in my craw. That is an expression which I don't know the meaning of. At least I do know the meaning, but I don't know where my craw is, frankly. One of the things is the feeling among a great many of the people that if the flying saucers are people from another planet or another world, that these people are so far superior to us, not only as far as scientific things are concerned, which could very well be, but all of the visitors from flying space have this grand benevolent feeling towards Earth. But all of the visitors from flying space have this grand benevolent feeling towards Earth. They're not contacting us directly, possibly because they feel that we have to give up our atomic weapons first, or they're afraid we're going to blow up the universe or something like this. Nowhere have I heard an expression that the visitors from outer space, if there are such, could be all as benevolent as the Russians, which is not very benevolent, frankly, or I should say the Russian government, let me put it that way.
You mean you haven't heard the theory that some of them are hostile?
I haven't heard very many of them, Frank. I'm speaking now. I mean, I've read several of those. I'm saying that in my contact through this program especially, that most of the people who have come up here have said that, these people are really fatherly and looking out for our interests. Jim, do you want to get into that?
Well, I wanted to get back to something Isabel said about there never having been a impartial...
Hold it back just one second.
Okay,
I think Isabel wanted to comment on what I said.
I just want to say very briefly that this is one of the things that makes these the contact stories, that's the type that you're referring to, unbelievable. And that is the fact that the extreme benevolence of these people, which seems to indicate that those who accept these stories are very much in need of reassurance, and that this is one reason why they welcome this type of blonde benevolent delusion, is because it makes the whole thing so much cozier and more homelike. And it certainly doesn't make very much sense. But the reports that, I'll say myself, seem to me rather convincing about landings and occupants are those in which neither benevolence nor hostility are manifested. It's simply strange, unearthly behavior, that's all.
That I could see possibly more likely. I just wanted to add that I would think it would take a tremendous ego upon the part of any one person or any group to feel that in this huge universe that we are the only people that have life. I think this would be a rather ridiculous statement, but I think that Jim wanted to go back to your statement about the Air Force. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, first I'd like to comment on that. I would say it takes an equal amount of egotism to feel that out of all the planets that might be explored thoroughly by an alien race, why they should all bunch up on this one and spend so many years just studying
How do you know they're all bunched up here? How do you know what other planets they're visiting or not visiting?
Oh, I have
information. We may just be a
information.
backwater tourist spot.
No, I don't think there's that many aliens. That surely not. That I mean, I certainly don't know. But
this could be the Asbury Park.
But perhaps we're some sort of freaks in the universe, and they're just studying us so minutely because of that. But if we were to think that even a small percentage of the sighting reports are real reports of flying saucers from other worlds, it would indicate a scrutiny which is quite startling, I would say.
Well, startling, but maybe we have been for the last 10 years, let's say, the subject of an IGY year, International Geophysical Year, only it's intergalactic geophysical year. Maybe they've been putting on a special study in which they're concentrating all their efforts on us.
I could see a few tourists going by, or let's say some spaceship landing here briefly and making a survey and going on, but surely not this continuing thing. I think that's just one point against the space theory. It's not a conclusive one. It's just a subjective feeling that I have. However, I wanted to get back to what Isabel said before about there never having been a scientific investigation of the subject. That I think we can agree on, and that brings us up to the point of NICAP, and I think that I had the feeling earlier that Isabel wanted to discuss NICAP a little bit. I only want to say this to begin it, that NICAP was organized as a scientific...
Jim, 1 second, just for the benefit of the lay audience again, what is NICAP?
That's right.
You paid to go to sleep at night.
Well, it's the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena in Washington, D.C., presently headed by Major Donald E. Kehoe, who is quite well known in the field of saucers. He's written several books, given lectures, and so on. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it seems that at the beginning, about 2 years ago, NICAP was organized as a scientific fact-finding group. And in the original prospectus that they sent out, it was described as such. Later, again, I won't go into the details, but the original group that started the organization was taken out of it, or left it, in one manner or another, and Major Kehoe became the director of NICAP, and since then we have found that it has become a saucer club which is... well, I'll have to say, in its own way, biased, the same as all the other clubs are, and I, for one, have been disappointed. Now, I'll just open the remarks that way.
I'm going to interrupt you at this point. You say it's a biased organization. I'm not here to defend it or anything like that. I don't think they need defense on my part. Would you say that the publication that you edit, Saucer News, that's biased?
Oh, indeed it is. Mm-hmm. Indeed it is. All the saucer publications are biased, every last one of them, and that's why we needed one that wasn't. And as I say again, as NICAP was first organized, it could have been a really unbiased scientific thing, much higher and above, on a higher plane altogether than any of the other magazines, including my own. And I was hoping for that. I really was. And now I find it very much like all the others. And that is, of course, just one of my criticisms of it.
Well, now, Jim, I'm just going to take issue with you right down to the bottom of this particular question. I know you have in your magazine referred to Major Kehoe's somewhat adolescent private war with the Air Force, which I think is certainly does less injustice to the situation. But I want to tell you that as it was originally organized, it's quite true. They had a much broader program, but it was so broad it was totally unrealistic. It would have required a budget of something like $1 million a year to carry it out. And when that thing was first set up, it was, well, I see you shake your head, but we'll come to that, we'll take that up again later. And when I first saw that first pamphlet that was issued by Townsend Brown and his group, the original group, as you say, I simply gasped. I said, who do they think they are? Where do they think they're going to get the money to carry out any such program as this? Because just on the extremely small scale in which my organization operates, CSI of New York, and that is Civilian Saucer Intelligence in New York, Mr. Pack.
Thank you.
I know that this is a costly business to do a thorough kind of research. Now, you say that Keogh is biased, by which I assume you mean that he concentrates on criticizing the Air Force. And this is the nub of the whole question. How important is the Air Force in this story? And it is my contention, first, that the Air Force, I assume you will not disagree with my statement that the Air Force is the only official investigating body in this country. They claim to have done a very good scientific job of investigation. They have done nothing of the sort, as I can prove with the repeated examples, and the Air Force is the key log in this log jam. And if you can shake the Air Force and break them down and get access to their files, you have got the keystone of the arch knocked out, that's all. Now, I'm not quite there, almost through. Now, Keogh is concentrating his energies on the place that is the most important. If you don't get those Air Force records released, if you don't break down Air Force silence, you will never get anywhere with it. And he is aiming his fire at the most important point, in my opinion. And therefore, this, if it's biased in that direction, it seems to me that it is properly biased, and this is the important thing for him to attack.
Well, you like his bias because your bias is in the same direction, and that's okay. But I'd like to answer a few of your other points. It is true in a certain sense what you say about the prospectus that was sent out at the beginning. Some of what they wanted to do would have taken a lot of money. However, you know, Isabel, you don't need a cent to be unbiased. You don't need a big organization. It's your method of study, not the volume of it, not the scale of it, not the number of people you have. It doesn't make a bit of difference whether they have a lot of money or none at all. As long as they could print any kind of a little sheet, not the big one they had in mind and the big one they promised to the subscribers, but anything at all. If they followed a scientific attitude. Do you know what I mean by a scientific attitude?
I do not know what you mean when you say that their investigations are biased. It seems to me that the investigations that Malthus has made have been extremely careful and thorough.
Do you think that based on the evidence that they have, that they can reach the conclusions that they've reached? And they have reached the conclusions?
Certainly, I believe they can. Of course they can. What other conclusions can they come to?
Let me just get in for a moment to remind our listeners, this is WOR Radio, your station in New York, 710 on the dial. Jim Moseley is with us this morning, Isabel Davis, Doug Dean, and Warren Pack. Mr. Moseley is the editor of Saucer News. If you care to contact Mr. Moseley in reference to his publication, if you're interested in flying saucers and unexplained celestial events, Post Office
163, John.
I have it in front of me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was wondering what you're showing it to me. Post Office Box 163, Fort Lee, New Jersey. A very funny bit. Mr. Moseley has little confidence in my memory. And I must admit, although I had not memorized the address, I had it right in front of me, and he was kind enough to hand me a copy, too. I was wondering what point he was trying to make. The mailing address for Saucer News is Post Office Box 163, Fort Lee, New Jersey. This is not a commercial, and I can assure you that Saucer News is a non-profit operation. It was not intended to be such, but as time went along, it turned out to be
Exactly, John.
And Doug Dean, the actor and singer, and I might add one of the finger snapper from the Irving Caesar show. And Doug is belts out a wonderful song. Great man in the musical comedy field. And, of course, if you remember Guys and Dolls, the Broadway production, you certainly remember Doug Dean. Isabel Davis is with Civilian Saucer Intelligence. There are some, and people are doubtful of one part of the title of the organization, intelligence. But that was just according to some mail that I get. We have a load of telegrams here. We're not going to read them at the moment, but believe me, we'll acknowledge everyone. We'll read everyone tonight. And if you didn't join us at the top of the show, because we're still getting telegrams from people suggesting, why don't you play the original comments over, as I said a moment ago, that our good friend Al Nielsen, the engineer, he recorded them. So they're on tape. Not that they're great or anything, but during the coffee break, we will not listen to music this morning, at least not all music.
Listen to the music.
Where do we get telegrams saying they didn't like the music tonight? This will happen.
Right. So, one telegram, though, before you make your comment. Would you be kind enough? There's one from our good friend Lester Del Rey.
Long John, I support your right to your belief and commend your sincerity, honesty, and deep sense of fair play. But I think you were wrong and dangerously wrong. I do not feel history can be repealed by mere goodwill and eloquent appeals to truth, whatever truth may mean. One man harmed by a phrase from Friedman is too great a danger to risk, and it's signed, as you said, by Lester Del Rey.
Well, if Lester is listening, I imagine he is. I certainly appreciate your comments, Lester. And as you know, we started by disagreeing, and we continue, and maybe that's why our bond of friendship will remain welded together for many, many years.
This is the third telegram that we've had, John, out of, I don't know how many we've had altogether, and we've read, everyone that's come in that is critical in any way. It says, Long John, why did you curtail your guest last night? Although I disagree with him, the program was stimulating. Could it be we are going into McCarthyism in reverse? Thank you. Signed, O.A. Graham.
All right, now, let's get back to this controversial subject, not about hate, but about nightcap and sausage.
I was recalling, of course, before I asked this question, I want to ask Isabel this question, but before I do, I was just recalling that there was a joke going around during the days when aliens were registering, and maybe they still do, that I forget who the comedian was, but when he got into a subject he didn't know anything about, he says, where does an alien go to register? That's how I feel a little bit. But I was just wondering, Isabel, about 15 or 20 minutes ago, you attacked very bitterly, I thought, the Air Force investigation of flying saucers and said it wasn't complete or exhaustive or scientific. And a few moments ago, you mentioned the this other group. I'm kicking these groups off. Nightcaps investigation. You felt this was a very good investigation. I was wondering how much information you have on the Air Force investigation and how much you have on this other one, and how do you base your theories on this amount of information?
Well, there's a good deal of evidence about to support the criticism of the Air Force investigation. They have been, to say the least, very misleading. They have claimed to be very thorough in their investigations when reports from the investigatees, people who were investigated, proved that they gave hardly any time to it at all. The Air Force claims that it spends $10,000 on every investigation, and I think $999.98 of that is wasted in some certain cases. There's a recent report, the one that Mr. Moseley referred to, the Fitzgerald case, the woman who saw the UFO quite close on her lawn, where after about 10 minutes of interviewing Mrs. Fitzgerald, a couple of low-grade Air Force officers, low-ranking, came to the conclusion that what she'd seen was the headlight of a railroad train. They never tested to discover that the headlights of a railroad locomotive was not visible from her house.
Isabel, can I interrupt just for one second? Perhaps we can do this better for the people like me who don't know too much about this. When did the Air Force, start its investigations? What have they made any statement? Any general statement?
Oh, mercy! Yes, they've made so many statements. You never know what they're going to say next. They've contradicted themselves over and over. And as a matter of fact, Jim, you know that you yourself reprinted that in Saucer News, that letter of Major Tacker to Dr. Leon Davidson.
That's right.
Defending the Air Force investigation, in which he convicts himself out of his own mouth of inconsistency and misleading statements. He says, for instance, here, There is a small, but this is Major Tacker of the United States Air Force, writing to the Tacker.
He's an active major. I mean, he's
Oh,
in the
yes,
Air Force.
yes.
He's at the Pentagon.
Yes, he's public information officer, isn't he? Yes. Here he says, a small but articulate segment of people are under the mistaken belief that the Air Force is withholding vital UFO information from the public. You see, small but mistaken belief that the Air Force is withholding information. All right. Then he gets down a few paragraphs below, and what does he say? He says, if we withhold certain information from the public regarding UFOs, it is not done not for the purpose of depriving the public of vital information and so on. In other words, he says first that they're not withholding information, and then 3 paragraphs later he explains why they're withholding information.
Well, Jim, maybe you can answer this question. I know you want to make a comment. Who is the senior officer in charge of any of this kind of investigation? Who would this major be responsible to?
Well, at the present time, it's changed so many times. You're speaking now of the Pentagon. The release of
the Air Force or the
of
Pentagon.
This information comes from the Pentagon. I believe that the spokesman these days is Major Tacker. He has a superior named Colonel Gilman, who I had a letter from recently that I'm publishing in my next issue, which is another matter. But I think they seem to be the ones that they're in the Office of Public Information, or if not in it, they're associated with it in the Pentagon. If I could go on to one other very important point, I think, in fact, it's the most important we could bring up tonight. I want to comment on something Isabel said a few minutes ago. Well, first I'd like to ask Isabel a question. Did I understand you correctly when I thought I heard you say that NICAP is unbiased? Did I have a yes or no answer on that? Did you say NICAP is unbiased?
Yes, I think they're unbiased. Of course, Major Keogh supports the extraterrestrial theory, which you do not. In that sense, he is biased.
Now, just a minute. NICAP was formed in order to reach conclusions eventually about flying saucers. Now, I want to ask you if by any stretch of the imagination an investigation can be unbiased which has formed a conclusion before it began. Do you know what I'm driving at? Do you deny that Major Kehoe had conclusions about flying saucers before NICAP ever came into existence, and had them for years before it became a organization, and expressed these opinions in books, lectures, and what have you for years? And you mean to tell me that a man directing NICAP, having his firm conclusions about UFOs from the very beginning, is able to form an unbiased conclusion at the end of the investigation? I don't see it. It absolutely contradicts all the rules of science to have your conclusion and then your investigation.
In the sense in which you're using it, he's biased in the sense that he has come to the conclusion on the basis of previous studies that he has made in investigations, as you know.
He reached the conclusion before NICAP began.
Yes.
And therefore, how can he be even conducting an investigation?
Well, what kind of unbiased do you want at this point, Jim? Do you want Major Keogh and the Board of Governors of the NICAP? And I think we ought to point out that this is not just one man's opinion, but it is shared by a number of others. Do you want them seriously to start investigating whether UFOs are real or not?
If they have their opinion...
you get this all the time, people starting all over again from scratch.
Because, Isabel, you've reached a certain stage in this thing, and you've formed opinions, and yours agree with Major Kehoe's. But even if mine did agree with Major Kehoe's, then believe me, it's beside the point, because I'm not claiming to be unbiased. I have a certain point of view that I express in my magazine, but if this is a scientific investigation, anyone can tell you that it can't be conducted that way. You accept the evidence as it comes in, and whichever way it points, at the end, you finally reach a conclusion, or perhaps you reach no conclusion at all. But I can't state often enough or strongly enough how strongly I feel about this, that all the members of the board there and Major Kehoe had their opinions, or they wouldn't have formed NICAP. Whereas the original group that formed NICAP, whatever else you may want to say about them, at least claimed to be unbiased and stated so in print, and I was thinking perhaps they would be. Maybe they wouldn't have been any better, I don't know. But that certainly is a very important point. It's true in archaeology, it's true in saucers or anything else. I mean, you were speaking of an unbiased investigation, and we still don't have it. Neither the Air Force, which is biased in one direction, nor with Kehoe, who is biased in a different direction. I don't defend the Air Force, but we don't have an unbiased investigation.
Well, all right, if you want someone to sit down and begin all over again from scratch without any opinions based on 11 years of evidence, and I'm using that term very broadly, okay, in that sense, nobody is unbiased, including NICAP. They're not unbiased. They have reached a conclusion. But I think that it is still possible to apply scientific methods. You will not find NICAP accepting every report that comes in. You remember they investigated the Scanlon case, and they are they're tentatively almost certain that was a meteor, that was not a genuine UFO. I don't know whether any fresh evidence has come up to change their opinion or not. But in that sense, I think it's too late for any group to be completely unbiased in this field. I don't think you could find a group of people.
Well, of course, that's the situation, you see, and that's another thing I'm driving
at. But I think this is irrelevant. The point is what Kehoe is doing important? Perhaps you don't think so because you don't accept the extraterrestrial theory. But to me, to anyone who feels that there is any meaning in the information we have at present, it seems to me that if we're going to get from the Air Force the information that they have, the Air Force are the people to attack.
Well, let me ask you this. In 2 years of NICAP, how much has Major Kehoe been able to accomplish in getting the Air Force to release their files, in spite of his harangues and so on? Has he accomplished very much in this direction?
No, and it's quite possible that what Major Kehoe will only be able to do is the same thing that I heard Professor Rines of Duke University say once. Someone asked him what he thought he'd accomplished with his years of investigation of ESP, and he said, perhaps all I have done is to keep the question alive, but this is a great contribution.
Now, just a minute. I'm very glad that you mentioned Dr. Ryan. I'm not thoroughly familiar with all his work, but I think I've read enough of it to have some intelligent opinion. Now, there's an entirely different situation. Dr. Ryan has run many series of tests over, 20 or 30 years. He's proven to some extent the existence of various forms of ESP, but even today, in spite of the evidence he's built up, which is quite considerable, anyone with the, the temperament of Major Kehoe or any other person who wants to reach a conclusion certainly could have reached a firm conclusion by now on the basis of Dr. Ryan's evidence. Yet, in the recent issues or the recent articles I've seen by Ryan, he is very cautious. Even now, he's very cautious about how far he can go. He just says that the evidence seems to indicate this, and maybe we can believe this, and maybe something else a little bit further along the line could be true too, but we just don't know yet, and we have to study some more. After 30 years, he's not sure. I'd say he is unbiased, and I take my hat off to Dr. Ryan. I like his field of research, and I like the caution with which he publishes his conclusions. But I don't like Major Kehoe's conclusions which were formed before he began.
I would disagree with you on Dr. Ryan's conclusions that they are unbiased. I think any scientist, I don't care who it is, starts an experiment. In the first place, you wouldn't be able to start the experiment if you didn't have an inkling that the thing was going to work out.
I wouldn't say that necessarily.
Well, I would. I mean, in the first place, going into the realms of thought, whatever man can think is possible. There isn't one single thing that's ever been invented on this Earth or any of the other planets that wasn't first a conceived thought. And it's just a case of time that will prove the conclusion.
Well, I think you're right in saying that you have an inkling of a situation existing before you start an investigation. There's some situation existing, there's some evidence is built up. It doesn't necessarily point anywhere, but the evidence is investigation. But then it's what you do from there on that makes you either scientific or unscientific.
All these scientific studies and everything else, it's always the scientists that never accept it. In fact, the scientists are the last ones to accept anything. And because they've got to have everything down in black and white, they look at things from a very cold aspect as far as I'm concerned.
They have to.
Well, this is the reason I think that we progress so slowly. I think that we could be forging ahead in far many different ways if it weren't for the fact that we're practically bludgeoned by science today.
Well, science walks a very narrow tightrope, a very difficult one. I on the same program...
But it's one of their own choosing, isn't it?
I on the same program have made some comments at one time about how sometimes they are very prone to be conservative. And yet, you have to think of it in two respects. If they're too conservative, they'll close their mind to new evidence. On the other hand, if they were to accept every theory, or even 1 out of 100 theories that are presented with very little, if any, evidence, why, we could forge off in 100 directions at once, and it would be all the worse. I think that they have to find a middle ground, and they're doing it as best they can, perhaps.
But, Jim, what you're saying is that as soon as anyone reaches a conclusion on any topic at all, he can no longer perform any further scientific investigation of it. I think the thing that marks a man as biased or unbiased is his willingness to accept new information and new evidence that contradicts his theory if it's available, and if it seems cogent to him, to examine it and this is where the open mind comes in, not in never coming to a conclusion, but in being willing to change your mind if you get fresh information that seems to indicate that it's desirable and necessary to do so. Why you're going seems to me you're going to forbid anybody to come to any conclusion and defend it at any time.
Not anybody, only some
bias every time anybody defends a conclusion.
No, I think that the average person can certainly and should form a conclusion about saucers, but again, it's not the same as what we're talking about. If NICAP is a scientific organization, I think it's unfortunate that the conclusions will... I mean, what I should do is to say, this month we had 100 sightings, 90% of them were solvable just from reading the article or something.
Well,
this may be the wrong...
evaluating, but you should just pencil things and let your readers form the conclusion. Seems to me if you say 90% were solvable just by reading the article.
A scientific saucer journal would be deathly dull.
Yes,
and Keyholes isn't dull, and it isn't scientific either, you see. That's my whole point. I mean, science isn't exciting, you know.
Well, all right. Now, I agree. You know, it has seemed to me that one of the most useful things that could be done would be to publish every year, not something like just a UFO annual, but strictly a report as dry as a rare almanac, which would contain every single report that you could get your hands on in print through that year. This would be very useful, but it would also be extremely costly, and you would have to be heavily subsidized by someone in order to pay the expenses of doing it. But the fact that you don't, and Keogh doesn't, and we don't, and nobody publishes everything, it seems to me that this is just kind of a constant perfection here.
Doug, I would like to ask one question. What does it really matter how many sightings have been seen? While I've been sitting here listening to this discussion, a thought came across my mind. This connects up, it may not seem at the beginning, but take the beginning of Christianity. When Jesus was on earth, he gave a philosophy to the people. Now, 2,000 years later, we've got hundreds of different types of people thinking different types of philosophies, all based on similar philosophies that Jesus expounded. And they're all caught up with the phenomena of the philosophy. They're not one bit interested in the actual idea or the ideal that was propounded in the first place. And I think this is the whole trouble with the saucer story today. All people are interested in is phenomena. All they're interested in is this person sees this sighting, and how is it scientifically categorized, and all this. The important thing is for the people to decide whether they're here or not. If they accept the fact they're here, to go ahead and do something about it with their own personal lives. Because I know what it's done for my life. It's changed my life completely. I think in an entirely different way.
Because of saucers?
Saucers started me into it. Because I began to realize that humanity, man himself, has a heritage that is far beyond anything that's just in this little tiny limited earth. And I think it's up to each individual to do something about it. The mere fact that we've got space people coming in here, if they're making contacts, if they're not, I don't know. I can't put my finger on and say this is true and that's not true. As far as I'm concerned, I judge nobody. But the mere fact that with all these thousands of sightings all over the world, and it's not just in this country, and it's every country in the world, and you know this, both of you, it seems to me that there's a far greater purpose than just bringing about scientific data.
Well, this leads me into my next point quite nicely. You mentioned about piling up sightings. You are right in one respect, that piling up sightings means nothing. I think that the important function of a scientific UFO group is to analyze the sightings and try to solve them by analysis. All the UFO magazines, including NICAPs, have a common failing, namely that they sort of gloat about the fact that a certain number of sightings are unsolvable. And instead of course, that takes a lot of time and work, I'll admit, but something like, for instance, Amy Michel did in his new book, try to find some order, some pattern in the thing. Try to do something other than just list a lot of unsolved things and say, ho, ho, nobody can tell me what this could possibly be.
Well, now, this takes me right back to my previous point, and that is the absence of any, the effect of the Air Force in the so-called investigation on the whole subject. What we need, I will agree, is not more sightings, but more sightings of which we can say that we know every single detail exactly. Now, if the Air Force had really done the job that it claims to do, we would have not 100 but 500 cases where every detail was perfectly reliable. Perhaps we have that many, I don't know, because I haven't had a chance to draw up a list of the ones that I personally think are very strong. Then you could say, here are 500 sightings, and we have the following phenomena reported about these sightings. Then you could begin to study them. But the fact that the Air Force hasn't done the job and has meanwhile made such a climate of opinion that people will not report sightings, not report them in detail, and we don't have enough very good, strong, solid, complete, detailed, exact reports, means that we don't yet have this data. And you can't tell which case coming up, which sighting of tomorrow or next week, may perhaps be another one of the kind that is going to be really useful when you come to analysis. I claim we do not yet have enough complete sightings for analysis, thanks to the lack of proper investigation.
We are talking this morning with Jim Moseley, Isabel Davis, Doug Dean, and Warren Pack. Jim Moseley is the editor of Saucer News, the official publication of the Saucer and Unexplained Celestial Events Research Society. The address for those that would like to contact Mr. Moseley to get further information about Saucer News, it's a bi-monthly publication, Post Office Box 163, Fort Lee, New Jersey. Isabel Davis of Civilian Saucer Intelligence is with us. Doug Dean, man that can really belt out a song. If you saw Guys and Dolls when it was on Broadway, you certainly remember Doug Dean. And Warren Pack, sports writer for the Journal American. Getting back with our guests of the morning, we have been discussing many things, Mr. Moseley. Returned a few days ago from Peru, and prior to the time we took our coffee break, there was a little discussion going on between Isabel Davis and Jim Moseley and Doug Dean in reference to why they are interested in flying saucers. I'd like to ask you, Warren.
To be very frank, I don't even know if they are interested in flying saucers or have any
Particular opinions on the subject.
Well, I'm interested in anything that is unusual. I think I have what is commonly referred to as an open mind. I don't believe that we've had visitors or we're about to have visitors because I think that perhaps at least an accident might happen and one might fall down someplace or something like this. I was delighted to hear Jim Moseley before make somewhat of a plea for a little bit of objectivity in this kind of work. I think that it's very nice to attack the Air Force, and I'm sure the Air Force has been pretty stupid in a lot of these things. I wouldn't deny that at all, because the Air Force has been stupid in so many other things that they shouldn't change just because this is UFOs. I do think that there are, as I said before, there are too many fraudulent people around in this work. I think that Jim was right in indicating, if I'm not correct, interpreting your words, Jim, you can certainly object, that they should, these groups, I can't remember all the various letters involved, and I don't want to name any one specific one, should list some of the ones that they've investigated and found to be phony or lies or mistakes and things like this. I don't think, on the other hand, Jim, that you can expect to have any great amount of objectivity as far as UFO is concerned, no matter who investigates. I think that even somebody like myself would have some reservations about them. I think that any scientist would have a reservation and therefore might be considered biased. I think that on the other hand, the average person who doesn't even know anything about science might be biased because it is against perhaps either his religious training or perhaps against his educational background. You can't find anybody unbiased on this subject, for that matter on any subject, possibly with the exception of Long John. I would like to see something in the way of an objective group form, certainly, if it's possible. I don't know how it would be possible, but I'd like to see somebody come out and say, quite flatly, that there are a lot of phonies in this business. I would like to see a lot of people come out and say that we should absolutely ignore these people and list who these people are, and we certainly know some of them. I think that it's very nice to attack the Air Force and the Defense Department, I guess, which is really the basic father of this whole group that does the investigation. But at the same time, I think that perhaps instead of just sitting around criticizing, some kind of objective work, that constructive work, might be done to influence public opinion. I certainly think that some of the magazines I've seen don't do this kind of work. I think they are in business for one specific reason, and that is to make themselves grow. I think that a lot of the people who are in the business are in the business to make money. Not all of them do, unfortunately. I like to see everybody make a dollar. But I think that some of them have too much of a tie-up with what I would call a weird spiritual type of thinking. I think that it is possible to think of a visitor from space, even though I reject the idea at the moment. I think it's possible to think of a visitor from space without thinking that he is here to bring us a new type of cult or religion or any type of 23 commandments instead of 10 commandments to differentiate. I wouldn't say that I have to be shown. I have a little belief and a little acceptance, Doug, as far as some things are concerned. I just think that the law of probability, which hasn't been outlawed or proved possibly, makes me feel that somebody who has no axe to grind and who is, let us say, of a public figure, that's a bad word to use, could have bumped into one of these things accidentally, that it doesn't always happen to somebody at Giant Rock Airport or to somebody who happened on the front lawn. I mean, I've had a front lawn. Other people I know have front lawns. I know an awful lot of people. There are a lot of newspaper people in the world. They haven't seen them. There are quite a few people besides airline pilots in existence. I think it's very nice to listen to the stories of some of the airline pilots, and I think that a lot of them are quite honest in their beliefs, and perhaps they have seen unidentified flying objects. I am inclined to feel that most of the ones we have seen are either mirages, dust, can't classify all of them, but with the exception of possibly being some type of airplane that we don't know anything about. And that is the end of my minority report.
Until the time comes that you see something, I'm trying to get it over.
I have seen things which I don't know what they are, but that doesn't immediately lead me to say that this is a visitor from I think it's the name of the planet that Prince Neosam came from, but
Titan or something. It's 8.5 light years away from this planet.
That's only roughly.
Dropping the book.
I think Isabel is ready to get the knife out, so I'll move over.
Get it out. She's sharpening it. The knife has been out. She's just holding up.
Oh, no. It's not a knife. It's just a couple of comments. First place, you're perfectly right. This subject is full of phonies. It's over for crackpots. And one reason is that there's a vacuum left by the attitude of the groups that more or less the official groups that have influenced public opinion, and I don't mean just the Air Force, I mean the scientists and the newspapers as well. Their silence or their strange pronouncements have created a vacuum into which the crackpots have rushed, and the crackpots are extremely vocal. They have no inhibitions about what they'll say. But don't forget that there are also phonies and cranks in other subjects, too. You have medical cranks, and you have diet cranks, and you have legal cranks, and you have political cranks. The difference where ufology suffers is in the fact that in these other fields there's, so to speak, a central core of more conventional opinion that outweighs, or at least counteracts the cranks, whereas in ufology there is none, because ufology is not a science. There's no use pretending it is. We don't have any objective standards. You can't take any classes in flying saucers at any recognized academic institution. You can't get any degree in ufology. You don't have to pass an examination to test in ufology. And the only experts are either self-appointed experts or people who are listened to because of their connection with something else. When Dr. Carl Jung makes a statement about saucers and later retracts it, contradicts himself, his statements are considered important, not primarily on the grounds that he's studied saucers, but on the grounds that he's a well-known and internationally known psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. It's too bad that the famous Project A of Ohio Northern University, which was launched in 1952, never became had to be discontinued, because that was the only, so far as I know, that was the only large overall concerted attack that was ever planned by a civilian group. This was going to involve all the professors of all the faculties of the university, but they, for a number of reasons, which I won't take time to detail, they had to fold that project. And this would have been if it had been carried out along the lines they wanted, would have been a very useful thing to counterbalance the Air Force inquiries. Then I wanted to say, you say that some of these journals should try to influence public opinion. Well, this is the important thing about NICAP. NICAP has had more influence on public opinion than any other publication in the country. It has acquired the support, the open, signed support of more prominent people than any other social research group. This is one of the reasons for its great importance. The Board of Governors alone is very interesting. Well, I'll give you the list. I won't read them because here again we have it's a matter of time, but there's the Board of Governors. And you've got, in almost every issue, you have someone coming out by name, or a person of prominence and influence and a pillar of society, a stable citizen, coming out and supporting these things, or making a statement of some sort that is valid because of the man's standing and because he's willing to have his name used. And I'm not aware of any other group that has enlisted this kind of public support at all. And as for the, why do they, if they've landed, why don't they land on the front lawns of some prominent people instead of obscure people? I think there's a very interesting reason for that. I think if they have, assuming that there have been landings, I think that they have landed on the front lawns of some prominent people. I could quote one case where this was mentioned by Dorothy Kilgallen in the New York Journal American. She had a report from England after she'd been, while she was there on a visit. She heard that there had been a saucer landing on the estate of a very prominent man. She never mentioned his name, and although there's a good deal of concerted opinion as to who it probably was, I probably better not mention it either. And that the occupants had been seen. But the point is that the more prominent a person is, the more apt he is to realize what's going to happen to him if he publicizes this event. And he possesses the position and the standing to not have his name used and not be overrun by publicity seekers, which is what happens to the less sophisticated people, publicity-wise, who allow their names to be connected with these stories and are generally just practically devastated by the public swarming in to take a look at the place.
Well, we have two different schools, for example, on something else, Isabel. And I invite Jim and Doug certainly to comment on it. We have certain people who say that flying saucers and reports of them can be found back as far as the Bible in various visions and so on. And, of course, there are other people who say this is ridiculous. This might be something fairly recent. Well, in either case, what are they doing? I mean, they seem to just be floating around aimlessly, landing on people's backyards and then getting up and going. What are they here for? I mean, I think that everybody who's in ufology, as you call it, seems to differ on what they're doing here, although I still insist that most people insist they're here to help us out in some way. Doug, would you like to comment at all?
Well, I could make a long comment on that. Leave that until a little later. What I'd like to ask is, I don't like this constant free use of the word crackpots. I don't think any... I didn't mean you. I meant Isabel. I didn't want to pin it down to anybody specifically, but I've used... It's not only Isabel. I've heard this word used so many times, hoaxes and crackpots. I don't think any person in the world has the right to judge another person, regardless. They can have their own opinion, but to come out and barefacedly say that a person is a crackpot, I don't think they have any right. You can go down the line with Einstein, Galileo, they were all called crackpots. Jesus was called a crackpot, and they crucified him for it. All the way through history, supposed crackpots are only people that have a different way of thinking to the normal accepted way of thinking, and it's because of this wanting to belong business that people have, that if somebody comes along that has a different idea or a different thought, they're immediately classed as a crackpot. And I think this is all wrong. I think the whole system of thinking.
Do you believe in the
wrong.
Hieronymus machine, or in the spectrochrome machine, or...
I'm not very familiar with that one. The one that I am a little familiar with is the Hieronymus machine, and I've never seen it work, but I accept the possibility of it.
How about Orgone box?
What?
The Orgone box, you know, Dr. Wilhelm
I'm not
Reich.
familiar with that either.
I was just going to say, I just want to add one thing. I know Jim wanted to comment. I think that you might concede, possibly, Doug, that some crackpots are actually just crackpots.
Well, I was going to say just that. You have great men throughout history that have been called crackpots and were not. And then you have other people throughout history that have been called crackpots and certainly were. And still are. Yeah. And you get this type of situation. You find in flying saucer research that some of these people who make claims about having had personal contact with the saucer occupants cannot be pinned down because they don't state enough definite facts to check on. Others can be pinned down, and others can be found making contradictions in their statements. The best example of the latter class is George Adamski, on whom I made a very, very thorough study for several months and finally published my results. To make a very long story short, there were internal contradictions in the story. There were witnesses who disagreed with each other, who later contradicted their sworn statements at the time of the incident. And you got down to the point where the story, as told by Adamski, fell by its own weight. Now, yet today, there are a lot of people that believe Adamski, and I want to know, is it necessary to believe him and give him the benefit of the doubt after all that? Surely you don't have to condemn him or silence him or anything, but still, the facts speak for themselves, you think?
Well, you say the facts speak for themselves, but this is still an opinion. My answer to that would be that I have watched certain, I'm not going to mention names of particular contactees, but I've watched over the last 2 years particular contactees and become well acquainted with their stories and everything, and I put the blame directly on the people themselves.
What people?
The people of the world, because they are so interested in phenomena, they are not content with just a single story. Now, there are certain of these stories that in the beginning they were quite acceptable, but because of insistence of people forcing their way into the contactee people's homes, and a situation that will happen where a person has an experience, they're suddenly pushed into the limelight, and which they've never been used to before. A lot of them come from small towns and everything, and they took it upon themselves to come out with the story, little realizing the notoriety and everything else that goes along with it, and they suddenly find themselves in a situation that starts mushrooming. And I defy any normal human being to continue talking truth the whole time when you've got people incessantly on your tail.
Well, now, are you
Why
saying...
does he have to continue talking at all? There are people who really have gotten rid of publicity. And if they really are honestly interested in avoiding the limelight and not being forced into talking themselves into contradictions, they can do it.
Well, it's not a case of not can do it. I know specific people that, because of the story in the first place, they couldn't go back to their own work, so they were more or less forced into seeking a livelihood any way they could.
Well, do you mean that because they were therefore forced into embroidering their stories?
It's a 50-50 proposition. I don't blame people in general completely. I think that it depends on the ego and the individual involved, and there are many extenuating psychological circumstances that make up this whole thing.
Well, you take George Adamski again. Before saucers came into his life, he had no profession, actually. I don't think he was really doing anything. He was living a sort of a semi-isolated life on the slopes of Mount Palomar. Then he got into the saucer thing. He published his first book, and lo and behold, seeing as it was the first widely known contact story, and the book sold, probably over 100,000 copies altogether. And then he was able to tee off from there and become a lecturer, but it was certainly no accident, and certainly nothing that he didn't foresee and look forward to. He was not forced into the limelight, and if he's made contradictions, it's not in what he said later in which you find the contradictions. It's right in his very first book, his very first story.
Well, what are contradictions? You can take the Bible, you can take any piece of literature in the world, and you're going to find contradictions.
Well, if you find it, that means there's something wrong.
What you want to find. If you want to find contradictions, you're going to find them.
Let me just interrupt for a moment, Doug.
Sure.
I get the feeling that you are not skeptical of anything.
I wouldn't put it that way. I try not to judge people. It's a pretty hard thing to do, but I try to take the stand where I allow the possibility that people are sincere and truthful in what they're trying to do in the overall picture.
But also that they could be mistaken.
I'd like to pick up that word sincere. I don't like that word sincere. You know what it comes from? It comes from... No, it comes from the two Latin words meaning without wax. when the old pottery makers cracked something they wanted to sell or broke a piece out of it, why...
Now we're back to
let's not get into semantics, because I get so bored listening at home with semantics.
Well, wait a minute now. I'm going to... they're important in that certain words have certain implications. The minute you say a person's sincere, there's a certain atmosphere that's phony, that's stagey about it. You wouldn't talk about a sincere child, because the child hasn't learned enough to deceive anyone. But what do you do? What do you do when the contradictions and statements made by one of the contactees are obviously absurd? What do you call this? Don't you ever make up your mind that anybody is wrong? Are we never allowed to form a negative judgment about anything or anybody?
No, I tried. Over the past year, I've tried to stop thinking negatively. I think in terms of every thought that can be conceived can be created, and I think that this is the whole thing in a nutshell. And I think that what can be thought of as a hoax maybe in the beginning can actually turn into a straight creation.
About how we shouldn't judge any idea or any person and more or less either accept them or keep an open mind on them, no matter what the evidence may be. But I just wanted to get in a fairly obvious point. Looking at these matters, saucers in this case, from a scientific viewpoint, it's always a matter of probability, in my opinion. That is science. It's based on probability, and I would say that the possibility of these contactees being right is highly improbable. Whereas in many cases you can never prove it absolutely, and perhaps in no case, but the intelligent man will accept the probable and reject the improbable.
Well, I would just make the one comment on it, that in the American way of life, we are innocent until proved guilty, and I think there's too much proving guilty on this account.
Well, do you say that anybody can be proved guilty? It seems to me that these contactists are proved guilty again and again, and if they are telling the truth, as I have said before, then the space people are terrific humbugs and braggarts and boasters and so on. But isn't there any point at which you say that guilt is proved? It seems to me that when you say you're open-minded and you don't want to think negatively about anything, you're really thinking very negatively when you give the same level of credibility to all reports. Because if you take the story of Othio Angelucci and the story of Captain William B. Nash at the same level and as having the same value, you thereby lower the Nash's story to the level of the Angelucci story.
And we also have the story of Mr. Van Tassel, I'll refer to again, who said that through telepathy he received the new history of the world as we know it, and that there was nobody on this earth, I don't know how many years ago, and that they all were transported here by spacecraft and formed a civilization here. Then we have somebody else whose name I can't recall, who said that this was quite possibly true, but actually the Earth was used as a sort of prison camp for the unwanted people of the other planets. This is one of the statements that the Space Brothers made to Adamski, as they claim to have made. And every one of these people has got a different story that's told to them from the horse's mouth.
Well, the way I would look at it would be from this point of view. I'm not saying that this is all true. I'm just leaving it open to possibility in this respect. If you took, say, 1,000 flying saucers from this Earth, supposing we reach the technology where we have our own flying saucers, and they all go from all different countries on Earth, just take off, and they all congregate around a particular planet. They're all going to have different ideas, and they're going to try and impose their own ideas. Like if it's a Catholic that goes in one particular saucer, he's going to try and impose a Catholic way of life. If it's a Jew, it's going to be a Jewish way of life. You get my point?
Oh, but this is not supposed to apply to the Space Brothers. The Space
You're
Brothers
taking this for granted. I'm not. I'm not making this supposition.
Well, I think we're getting into discussion of more or less of Doug's thoughts about it. I know Doug fairly well. I think that Doug is just saying that he just doesn't choose to
Make up his mind.
judge. No, I say he doesn't choose to judge. Not a question of making up his mind. Where he thinks there is proof, he perhaps then makes up his mind. Where there is no proof, one way or the other. I mean, he hasn't met Mr. Van Tassel, for example, or he hasn't met some of these other people. If he met them, he might possibly change his mind.
But this is another fallacy, or the idea that the only way you can make any judgment about these stories is by personally meeting the people.
Oh, I disagree with this entirely.
Internal evidence means something. I mean, these men, someday when Adamski's dead and Van Tassel's dead, they're only going to be their books to go by. And then you'll have to judge by the same thing that people judge by who haven't met them in person.
Well, I'm just going to add in this comment. I feel rather fortunate to have been out of the country when this fellow, whatever his name was, this prince from 7.5 light years away, 8.5. I think if we're going to even entertain the possibility that that fellow is telling the truth, or what little I know of his story, but that's enough to know right there. If we can entertain the possibility that he is really from a planet 8.5 light years away, then we are being a little bit too open-minded, to put it mildly. I think that just takes the cake. That beats Adamski, that beats all of them.
I don't call it open-mindedness to condemn somebody without 100% conclusive proof. Look back in your history and see how many people have been put in the electric chair and hanged for proof that was supposed to be conclusive on circumstantial evidence.
Well, we're not hanging Adamski.
We're hanging a person by words, which is just as bad.
Well, it seems to me that if a man puts forth a story or a opinion, whether it's on flying saucers or anything else, if he publicizes that, he gives lectures on it, he writes books on it, surely he invites criticism. His story will either stand up to criticism or it won't. He should
criticism, yes, proof. But you're not putting. Well, there again, we've
and I'll tell you
this discussion of proof on this show so many times. Long John himself has said it that what kind of proof would you want that a person's from another planet? I mean, this can go on indefinitely.
Well, that's quite true, but I think that we have so many cases. I mean, I'm sorry, Doug, you haven't met some of these people. I mean, perhaps...
I've met quite a few of them.
Well, I mean, some of the ones that I mentioned specifically, I mean, now if we have the machine that Mr. Van Tassel is supposed to be building that's going to enable you to, replace old parts as they wear out and things like this, and we found out Prince Neosam also had the same thing. But when you ask them to see, not especially on this program, but see at any time that they see fit a demonstration, there's always something wrong. Just like you've seen or heard possibly people come up here and they're great ESP people or they're great telepathists until they get up here. Then all of a sudden, either they had dinner at 8:30 instead of 8, which is what one person said, and therefore he couldn't really work very well then, or there were too many skeptics around, or there's always some excuse. Now, I don't say that he has to give 100% proof. I wouldn't even, to me, in something that is, what we might say, fantastic. I mean, some of these ideas you might call fantastic. If I had 5% proof, I would perhaps have a little bit more open mind than some of them. But when I see certain evidences of, shall we say, profit sneaking into the picture, or it seems to be the main idea of the whole thing, then I must be a little cynical on what the man is offering. If you, for example, as you have told me some of your ideas, I know that these are your ideas, and that's all there is to it. It's not a question that you're selling a book or that you are going to be giving lectures on this thing, although not all people who give lectures or write books are just interested in the money, possibly.
Well, every statement that I make is my own personal opinion, so that's not out of the record. But to pick you up on one thing, I think John will kind of corroborate this in a way, because he's made the statement quite a few times that as far as his knowledge is concerned, he doesn't know of any person that has really made any what you call profit out of this whole thing.
Well,
I'd like you to make a comment on that.
Yeah, I would like to make a comment on that. I've made that statement many, many times. You're quoting me correctly.
As far as making a few dollars to get by, to break the nut, if I may use that vernacular expression, I think many of them have been able to accomplish that, which is certainly nothing wrong. In other words, if a man comes in from the coast to give a lecture here, I can see no reason why he should hitchhike across country and have to beg, borrow, and steal in order to get a place to sleep.
You're speaking of space people now, especially, aren't you, John?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about the contact.
You think Dr. Will... Oh, I'm saying that's something to do with space. I mean, for example, Dr. Wilhelm Reich made a few dollars out of this. No, I'm serious.
Out of flying saucers?
No, out of other... I'm talking about fantastic ideas now.
Well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about saucers?
I thought you were talking about...
I thought so, too.
Specifically flying saucers.
Well, I mentioned other fantastic
Well,
ideas,
I think it's wrong to group them together, because at the moment we're talking about flying saucers and the people that claim they've had contact. Now, the only person, to my knowledge, that may have made some money, I'm certainly not against a person making money. I see no reason why you should. In other words, I have tremendous respect for my doctor, Dr. Nicholas Como in Brooklyn. I have tremendous admiration. And the fact that the guy makes money, I don't go home and say something wrong with him, because he charges. And I see no reason if anybody makes money. You're a sports writer. You happen to make a very, very good dollar in the New York Journal American. I don't pick up the Journal American and read Warren Pack's column on the sports page and say, I think there's something wrong with this man because he does this for a living. There's nothing wrong with that, Warren.
Well, a sports writer or a doctor is in a profession, at least close to a profession that is accepted. When we go away from the so-called general order of life, I think that you must stop and wonder why a person is doing this. I don't think it's always a question of money. There are some other factors involved. The factor of being recognized. This, I think, is the major factor in all these prestige involvements, titles. I mean, forming their own publications and things like this is very important.
I remember the time when medicine were looked upon as voodoos and everything else, going way back. What is now a great science in medicine.
What's voodoo? And I know what voodoo is. I mean, is it recognized today?
No, but I mean...
By the American Medical Association?
No, what I'm saying is that thousands of years ago, the witch doctors and the voodoos and all the other things were looked on as something almost horrible to have to even contemplate. It was on the rarest occasions that they go to these people. But after many, many years, it became a recognized profession. Any profession you've got today has started out from a different point of view as far as the normal thinking is concerned.
Under adverse circumstances, difficulties, tremendous amount of difficulties to become recognized.
Take psychologists today, or there are the chiropractors today. I would say that probably within the next 25, 50 years, depending on how it works out, but they will probably, all these men will become recognized in the medical profession. It takes time to break down the recognized.
Too bad, Doug, that because of your belief you aren't a betting man. Because
I have no belief.
I would be willing. I mean, your acceptance is that you would be willing to wager what we might say in England, a few bob on that prediction. I'd be willing to wait 25 years.
I don't gamble.
I know that. I just said you would. I don't either. I have nothing but sure
I have
things.
done it, but it's strictly for fun.
Well,
pardon me. I just wanted to say I'd like to apologize to all UFO people for being classified with chiropractors. Go ahead, Ms. Adele.
I just wanted to say how much I agreed with both you and Long John. That first place, not sure just exactly how much money any of these people have made. In the second place, I think the money is in most cases secondary. I think that it's much more pleasant for the baker in Detroit to be introduced as Prince Leomon than to be introduced as a baker from Detroit.
Neosam. Correct pronunciations are of great importance.
Yes, indeed, certainly. I think it's that Mr. Howard Menger enjoys a great deal more self-esteem as well as esteem from other people when he says that my profession is that of author and lecturer than when he says that when he's referred to as a sign painter from Washington, New Jersey.
I'll tell you one thing, he was
a lot more dignified.
He was making an awful lot more money when he was a sign painter.
Well, we don't know enough very much.
Money
about
is in everything. Money is in everything, Doug.
No, but I'm just saying, when you start
May I just ask you this, though? We have lost contact with Howard Menger. I think you have. I know that I have since that. Incidentally, let me remind our listeners that they should get a copy of Argosy magazine dated January 1959. And in that magazine, my good friend Jules B. St. Germain, the attorney of Lynbrook, Long Island, he has an article in that edition, and it's a great article. A lot of pictures in there too, the photographs by Martin Dane. But the reason that I think you'll be interested in the article is because it's a complete report on the first East Coast Interplanetary Spacecraft Convention that was held on September 13th and 14th in the beautiful hills of New Jersey. You certainly want to read that. Argosy, 1959. Now, let me complete my statement. I don't know how I got this in, but I think people want to read it. I'll agree with you that I think that Howard made more money as a sign painter. However, at the present time, I think we would both be wrong in assuming that, because I think that Howard has progressed. Howard has given a number of lectures. He's coming out with a new book. I understand if you're one of the first 1,000 to buy a copy, that your name will be on a special scroll that's going to be presented to the space people. Are you aware? Did you send for your copy?
No.
Can you imagine it'll be number 1001? This out by one.
Your loss. It's your loss.
John, even if I send a telegram over there asking for 1,500 copies, that only 1,000 of the names I would choose would go on the list. This is heartbreaking.
Those are the breaks, you know.
Yeah.
John, I'd like to make a point here just for a moment. We mentioned two of the motivating forces, behind the contactees. One is money, a larger one, and more important one would be prestige. But I think there's a third one that's very often overlooked, and which I have thought a lot about, and that is this. You take a man who has a set of ideas, opinions, and so on, about how the world should be, and he expounds these ideas, and he doesn't get very far, because everyone has their thoughts as how the world should be. And then it occurs to him, for one reason or another, that if he puts these same thoughts and these same philosophies in the mouths of space beings, it's going to be much more acceptable to an awful lot of people. And to that type of thinker, it's not exactly fraud, what he's doing. It is and it isn't. It's sort of a double standard there that's sort of hard to understand, and yet I think I can understand it to a large extent. This is the motivating force behind Adamski, for one, I know, because I looked into it. He was expounding philosophical ideas for years before he ever met any space people. He had moderate success in California.
Before he met or allegedly met?
Well, before he thought he met, or however it may be. And since then, of course, he has expounded more or less the same ideas, and they've been much more acceptable. And it's worked out good for him, and he supposes, or he feels, that it's worked out good for everybody, because these ideas should be listened to and should be put across, and now they're being done just that. So I think that's a very important point that's very often overlooked.
Absolutely right. These are men with a message. They are crusaders, and they may very well say to themselves that these are lies in a good cause, or misleading things in a good cause.
I just want to add one thing, that Adamski has been known to have said in print, and I saw the letter and copied it in my so-called expose, that it is sometimes necessary to enter the back door in order to get the truth across. I think that's the crux of it.
So rather than condemn these people, I think they should be helped along a little bit. If I were going to condemn anybody, I'd condemn the politicians of today that come out with out-and-out lies just for own personal gain.
Oh, there's enough condemnation to go around among the politicians and the contactees.
Well, yes, I have a whole page of notes on that. I wanted to just recap a little bit what we've already covered. I think we did discover about reluctantly, I drew it out of you, I believe, that NICAP is not unbiased. We have established that. We have also established, I think a little more easily, that they have not succeeded in breaking through the censorship, or if there is censorship, from the Air Force. Now I wanted to get down to a couple other points. You mentioned that there is a board of directors and so on, which is quite true. There's some prominent names among those people. But would you deny that the magazine itself is the opinions of Major Kehoe? I mean, there's nothing wrong with this, the fact that it is his opinions, but would you say that the magazine is put together with the consultation and with the advice and the help of these prominent people, or would you say that it's basically a one-man organization?
Well, I certainly would say that if the Board of Governors found that Major Kehoe was writing and publishing material which they found themselves in sharp disagreement, individual governors would certainly resign, and as a group they would fire Major Kehoe if he were not expressing their views.
Well, I think to a certain extent that is true, but still in other words, this Board of Governors, as I've always understood it, one thinks of a Board of Governors as sitting around a board table or something, or having meetings. I don't think this happens. Now, does it, or does it happen occasionally? I'm not even really sure.
They have meetings occasionally, because as you know, the governors are located geographically fairly widely separated, and they're men with business and professions, and it's not too easy to get them together physically as a group. But this certainly wouldn't prevent any one of them from objecting violently in writing or consulting by letter or by phone with his fellow governors if they felt that Kehoe was going beyond the bounds. And so far as I know, it's never customary for a Board of Governors to employ as an executive director somebody who is not in agreement with their policies or with whose policies they're not in agreement. I don't think the point has any relevance.
Well, of course, what I had hoped for at the beginning, and what hasn't happened, was a sort of a scientific council of advisors of some sort. Now, these prominent people are prominent by definition, but even so, in a certain sense, their opinions are not worth more than the next man's, in that, in some cases at least, the subject of saucers is not in their particular field. They add prestige to the thing, but they don't add very much. Certainly,
I saw the names, Jim. I wouldn't say they would be called prominent, other than the fact that
some of them are.
Most of them are retired Army and Navy.
Yeah, well, they can be called prominent, but for instance, if Albert Einstein makes a pronouncement on politics or some such subject, we can respect him as a scientist, but we don't have to accept his word as standard in a field that isn't his own. And so I respect the opinions of these prominent people on the Board of NICAP, but I don't, in other words, I personally wouldn't be drawn towards socials anymore because they have made a statement, because their opinion can just as well be wrong as anyone else's. This isn't a matter of majority opinion, it's a question of who is right, and that's a scientific matter, not a question of how many people agree or disagree with you.
Well, that's your opinion. It's the scientific matter. As far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't take the words of scientists on this subject.
Well, what I mean is that it's a matter that has to be approached scientifically.
I disagree with you.
In other words, you can't take an opinion poll at any time in this country and find out whether saucers exist or not. Probably the minority would say that they exist, and it wouldn't make any difference if 98% of the people said they existed. They still might not, although it might be more likely, but the point is it's a question of fact, not of opinion, and sometime we'll get all the facts.
Well, that's very true, and it's a question of who is going to establish what the facts are in this case. Now, so far as your criticism of these people not being ufologists, experts on saucers are concerned, and you don't consider them any more reliable than Joe Dokes of Pumpkin City Corners.
No, not quite, but
I think it seems to me that this too is irrelevant. What we do know about these men is that they are men who have had the capacity and the ability to at least make themselves known in some other field. They are not non-entities who are using saucers as the means of obtaining the limelight. they are men who have demonstrated certain abilities.
What did Major Kehoe demonstrate?
Huh? He's a retired Marine flyer, and he's an author, freelance writer, so on.
Well, I would agree with you on that last statement you made, Isabel, about them not taking the limelight on account. I think many of these scientists have specifically used this thing, coming out with broad statements and everything like that.
No, we're
on the
speaking now.
on the other side, yes.
So it doesn't make any difference which way they fall. They're still using it as a glorification to their own
Well, we're still
reputation.
speaking of the board of NICAP. These are not mainly scientists. These are men who are, as Isabel says, prominent in one field or another. But I still think that my criticism holds true. I think it's nice in a certain respect that the people of some prominence have felt, let's say, unembarrassed enough about saucers to make a public statement about their feelings. But beyond that, I don't think it has much importance, except in that some timid soul, seeing that Admiral so-and-so has made a statement, he may feel called upon to make his sighting public, whereas otherwise he might have been too afraid. But other than that, it doesn't mean much.
Well, other than that, that's a pretty big other. That's a pretty big other. If the support of people who are supposed to be in a broad sense and with broad general standards, intelligent and competent, doesn't encourage others to express their interest and make reports, well, what is going to?
Having science has been put up on a tremendous pedestal, especially in this country and probably in Russia too, the big nations. And I can only cite the little story that Court Hastings has told a few times on this show. But I don't remember exactly what country it was, Denmark or one of the small countries, where the farmers were all rushing into town, telling the townspeople and the scientific authorities about these big rocks that were falling around their farms. And, of course, all the scientists, the know-it-alls, got together and said, oh, this is impossible. Rocks don't fly from the sky. It took many years of supposed scientific research to finally realize that these actually were rocks from the sky. They were meteors. But, of course, at the time, all the poor peasants and the farmers were idiots.
Well,
and I think this holds true in any field.
That's a valid point, but it's beside the point here, actually.
I don't think it's beside it at all. I think it's a good analogy.
Well, can I get in for a moment? I think we're throwing around a lot of names and people and so on. First of all, I want to say something about board of directors. As we know from the unfortunate so-called communist front organizations, a lot of people are board of directors for a lot of things they know nothing about. I don't say this is true of NICAP. You notice I'm throwing around names pretty good now. Two of the letters I've got down. I want to know what makes Major Donald E. Kehoe, and I figure this must be Major retired, an expert on flying saucers or UFO or something like this. What makes him an expert?
Well, he started in 1949. He was a writer he had done some writing on aviation for True magazine, and he was asked by Ken Purdy, who was then the editor of True magazine, to go down into Washington, go around and talk to some of these pilots and various people and see if you can get a story on this and try and find out what in the world this is all about, or not in the world. And he did that. He made this investigation, and he wrote a report called The Flying Saucers Are Real, which are published in in the January 1950 issue of True magazine, which sold more copies than any other issue of that magazine.
Let me just interrupt for 1 second.
Yeah?
His investigation, you approve of his investigation only. His was a full scientific investigation.
It was an investigation by a man who knew pilots, who knew the air, who was himself a flyer, who had been a public information officer in Washington for the Department of Commerce, so he knows how public information officers tick, and what things are said and what things are not said, and who knew how to talk to people and what weight to give the evidence. And he did go and interview these people and ask questions and followed up on some of the suggested explanations and decided that they were pretty well nonsense. Yes, I think it was an investigation by a competent person. He became very interested. And
no, I didn't say that. There's a little bit different. You can have an investigation by a competent person, and you could have a competent investigation by a competent person. There's a little difference. I want to know what makes you think that his investigation was any more competent than the Air Force's.
Well, you see, the Air Force investigation is so riddled with inconsistency and dishonesty and misleading statements and disingenuousness all over and over again. At the end of 1949, do you know what they said? The Air Force issued a statement that Project Saucer, which is their project for studying saucers, which they launched in, I think, 47, wasn't it? It began at the same year, the Arnold sighting, was discontinued. This statement was widely publicized all over the country. Press and skeptics and scientists and everybody said, see, the Air Force doesn't even consider that these things are worth studying anymore. That's how unreal the whole thing is. Now, it's perfectly true Project Saucer had been discontinued, but it had been replaced by a project of a different name to do exactly the same thing. But they allowed this impression to get out, and undoubtedly this is the impression they wanted to create, and it certainly was accepted far and wide. And this is not the only case. This famous report number 14 that was issued in May, I think it was 1955, dated May 55, although they didn't release it until the fall of that year. The figures and the treatment of the data in that and the way that thing was issued to the public in the form of press releases, that is, the digest, their supposed findings, is really the most astonishing bit of smoke screen that you ever read in your life.
I'll take for granted this may be true, but I still want to know what makes you think that Major Kehoe, maybe a very fine gentleman, why you feel that he made a more exhaustive or a more expert investigation. Is it just because he came up with the same opinion that you have, possibly?
Oh, no.
Do you think that anybody has ever made an investigation and come up with a decision that there are no flying saucers that you would approve of? I mean, any person who, if anybody made such a survey, would you be skeptical?
Here's the interesting thing, and that is that anyone who has really studied the subject, I don't know of a single intelligent skeptic. I'd like to know of one. Someone who has really studied it, really looked into the reports. There are no such people. You will find a great many skeptics, scientists, and others who say that they have studied the literature and looked into the cases. But the minute you begin to ask them about specific aspects or specific famous classical cases, you find that they don't really know the subject at all.
First thing about it.
Well,
so
everything involved,
foregoing investigation.
Everything involved, as far as I'm concerned, is hearsay. I don't care what you say; it is all hearsay, unless you yourself. I mean, I'm not talking about you personally. I mean, either myself or Doug or somebody sees one or sees what they think is a flying saucer. Therefore, an investigation actually cannot reach any justifiable conclusion because there is nothing to prove at the end. I mean, either you have seen it or you haven't seen it. And I don't care how many people I go talk to. I can talk to 1,000 people. They all say, I saw a flying saucer. I can still come up with a negative report, actually.
Well, it's quite true that you apply, and a great many people apply, totally different standards of judgment in this respect than with respect to some of the orthodox conclusions of orthodox science. You ever seen an electron or an electron path? Have you ever seen an atom through an electron microscope? No. But you take somebody's word for it, don't you, that they've seen it. They may be lying in their teeth. They may have faked those photographs. You don't know.
It's quite possible. However, nobody ever tells me, they look in this microscope and they see a message from God.
Well, I'm not talking about that type of report, Warren.
Well, I mean, you said, for example, before, and I'm not going to back the Air Force in any way, especially, but you said that Air Force reports were so mixed up and confused and other things. The whole field is that way. I mean, the whole field of ufology is mixed up, confused, and in a state of constant flux.
Well, this is why I would defend a man, my own personal opinion as far as Kehoe is concerned. I think out of all probably in the entire world, as an individual, this man has done more to try and get the flying saucer story out to the public.
Well, now that we're back at speaking of Major Kehoe again, I'd like to bring out just one more point. I believe it's my last, because I don't want to keep running down Kehoe, or someone will think that it's some sort of inter-magazine jealousy of some sort. It's not that at all. I think he has a very fine magazine, and better than mine in most respects. But I wanted to just bring out one final point on this. I think, Isabel, you'll agree, and I think I remember from some of our earlier conversations on the subject, that you feel that one of the most important things about NICAP is the influence that they've had on public opinion. I think you said something about that this evening, as a matter of fact. And I don't see how that gels. Granted that they've had some influence, or perhaps even quite a bit, but it doesn't gel too well with what they've printed themselves. The interest is waning again. They need money. They're in bad shape. I know this is all true to a large extent, but it doesn't seem that they've really been able to sustain any rebirth of public interest. It seems that their subscriptions are dropping off, which happens to a lot of us, not only to them. It seems that they not only are similar in format and in ideas to most social organizations, but they're beset with the same problems, and they're waiting for public interest to come up again.
Both of your statements are true, but you're using the word influence on the public in two different senses. The sense in which I say they have had more influence than any other group is that they have more people have been willing to allow their names to be used by NICAP, and allow NICAP to print statements of theirs in favor of the NICAP theory, the extraterrestrial theory, than any other group. Now,
I'll grant that. Yeah.
All right. Now you say, but nevertheless, they still have financial difficulties. Well, there are two or three factors you have to bear in mind about the finances, and one is that Major Kehoe inherited from the original group a large number of problems. It is one thing to set up your own program, your own budget, your own commitments, financial and otherwise, and on a realistic basis. And it's quite another to take over from a group that has set up a much too ambitious program that was quite impractical and had very many serious flaws and criticisms against it. Now, just a moment. I'm not quite through, Jim, and then I'll be as quick as I can. It's quite another to take over these things and to have to correct them and work your way out of them. And at the time that Kehoe took over, as he stated in his reply to your criticism in his magazine, there were financial commitments such as to the offices that they had. They probably had a lease on them down there, which he had to carry out until the lease was up. He had a lot of things to contend with down there that he has had to struggle out from. And then on top of that, you must remember that as far as the general public is concerned, there are a great many people for whom a subject ceases to exist when it ceases to be in the headlines. Now, if we had a great wave, another sighting wave, such as in 52, you would undoubtedly see a great many people interested in you, in CSI, in NICAP, and so on, because people are interested in what's in the news. And what isn't in the news, they aren't interested in. Therefore, I think that the fact that the NICAP's financial difficulties do not disprove the fact that they have had more influence, the statement I'll say, that they have had more influence on public opinion than any other single group.
Well,
in spite of the fact that they have had hard sledding.
I think that their present financial difficulties, however, are directly connected with the lagging of public interest rather than the ambitious program that you spoke of, which they inherited from the first group. I think they got out of that situation a while back, and I think that if there were new subscriptions coming in at the rate they had hoped and so on, that they wouldn't be in the shape they are in now. I mean, it's a minor point, actually. I hope they get out of their troubles, but I think it is related to a deeper problem than you suggest.
I was just wondering, Jim, if possibly people listening in might be interested in knowing the opinions of each one of you, Doug and Isabel, about what you feel, if you have any feeling,
will be the next advancement in the source of story.
I'm not speaking about a fictional source of story, believe me. In other words, there has to be, if there are flying saucers from another planet, or whatever you want to call it, there has to be a progress. There has to be either what you want to call an actual contact, or something else has to happen. I don't believe that if there are flying saucers and people from other planets, that we're just going to keep on flitting back and forth, seeing them occasionally and so on. And I was wondering, do you have any opinion? And we'll start with you, Jim, possibly.
Well, if they did happen to be from another planet, I should think it would all end when someday the space people favor us with a landing or a near landing in a place where it can be fairly well proven. But my opinion, of course, is that these are made on this planet, and I suppose or assume that the day will come when those facts will come out, and that will more or less end the situation.
Jim, I know it's not my turn, but let me come back to you. All right.
I knew this would happen.
Beg your pardon. Yeah.
Well, I'll break in after I'm running this thing for the moment while John's out the teleprinter. Just saying, quite frankly, that I would find that solution even more hard to accept than the solution of the outer space people, frankly. I can accept that there are no such things at all, that we have been seeing, I don't know what you want to call them, some kinds of mirages, or I could accept possibly there are some kind of extraterrestrial people, but the fact that these are supposedly planes from, I don't care where you want, some other country or from our own country, I think is a little bit hard to take, frankly. I mean, they'd have to be seen landing someplace near a field. They must come out of someplace. I mean, if they were
40,000 miles an hour in radar.
Well, it's probably a little long to go into now, but it gets back to the exact same point I was making earlier. In your 40,000 mile an hour cases and all that, you have a lot of difficulties. These are cases which are not documented to the extent to convince me, for one, that they are authentic in all details. Before you can accept those types of figures, you have to have a lot more solid evidence than we now have. You do have evidence of things exceeding the speed of conventional aircraft, making near right-angle turns, having weird colors about them, and so on, but you don't have evidence of these tremendous sizes that have been described in some cases, a half a mile long, 2 miles long, and all this kind of thing, and 40,000, 25,000 miles an hour. That is in the realm of science fiction, I've learned.
Well, it's evidence as far as you accept it. There are other people that do accept it.
I think Isabel will remember the story on which I don't have all the details, but do you remember the time that he was supposed to have taken a ride in a spaceship one night and visited 20 people, and he sent them letters afterwards asking what they were doing at 3 o'clock in the morning, or whatever time he was there.
Yes.
And the best part was that most of them couldn't remember having done anything special. They had no recollection. They slept thoroughly, soundly, like any other night. And then when the results came in of this poll or whatever it was, he just sort of quieted down about the whole thing. None of them had seen him, and yet he claimed to have visited all of them, and they didn't get their wires straight somehow, or they got their wires crossed, and they were contradicting him on this point.
I remember George Van Tassel gave me a terrific letdown because he was telling how he and his friends and neighbors and so on in that friendly old Giant Rock Airport vicinity practiced ESP and used experiments and so on. And this was very intriguing until I found out that they used this great gift, this great talent to remind Mother when she's down in the grocery store away from town what she must bring home that they forgot to put on the shopping list.
That would be awful. Don't laugh at that. That would be very practical.
And then there was
this was the same time.
No, this was long before they were starting. This was before he had his contacts. As I remember.
Is it alleged conduct?
Whatever you want to call it.
I think he had contacts, John.
Then am I wrong in saying about Van Tassel? I think this story has been told several times before, but I was rather amused when he was building his Temple of Wisdom, was it called, or something?
In the College of Universal Wisdom.
Yeah, and he was getting all these donations together, and the first thing, and the last I heard, the only thing, maybe more has been done now, but the very first thing that was built was the outhouse, And I thought that was rather significant and symbolic, perhaps, of the whole enterprise.
Why, Jim?
This is. I thought, Doug, I wouldn't stand for this. I would certainly get up now and.
Well, listen, I want to go back to
what
Jim's...
negative thinking? I mean, this is.
Well, it's a negative evening.
Negative about nature.
Well, it's all a natural process and health and so on. These people favor nature all the time.
Perhaps
natural
the secret
Jim, I would like to go back to your government devices theory, please. May we?
Yeah,
Do you mind? Because the government devices theory that Jim's...
Davidson theory, too.
Yeah. Now, you begin, of course, and someday Jim will have to sit down and pick out 50 or 100 cases, both of which we agree on the reports about. I will omit the 40,000 miles per hour.
Thank you.
And, but I will insist that there are many, many reports of the maneuverability of these subjects. These are maneuvering in a way that no conventional aircraft can perform. You'll just have to stipulate that, as Perry Mason says.
Why?
Because, well, I haven't got time to give all the reports, and I don't have them here.
Seriously, I mean, I could come up here tonight and tell you that I saw something in the sky that went, didn't go zigzag, and it didn't go crisscross, it went crissy-zig, sort of. And just because I report it doesn't mean anything. It's another story. So maybe I had the blind staggers, or maybe I was drinking Long John Scotch, as it's called.
Well, now, just a minute. In view of the climate of opinion, Warren, if you made public a story of that sort, and you had a responsible position, like airline pilots, you would stick out you're sticking your neck out very hard, and it's not always. There are many reports from pilots we haven't had for just that reason, and therefore the ones that they have, you have to give some weight to this factor.
I don't for one reason. First of all, as far as pilots are concerned, I think a pilot, when he becomes tired, is liable to see anything up there.
Yes, but these things are seen by pilots who are not
you ever drive in the
tired.
desert, Doug?
You're making an awful statement.
I am?
Yes.
But these things are seen by pilots who are not tired.
These men that fly the planes and have millions of passengers' lives and responsibilities on their shoulders, there has not been one single pilot, either in the Air Force or the airlines, that has ever been grounded.
Oh,
they have told them, listen, if I found out that a man had fatigue and was having hallucinations, I wouldn't want to fly in his plane.
I guarantee you, yes, I guarantee you continue to fly in people who have seen things. It doesn't mean that they're overtired. If you can see something for a second like this, and either flying or driving, and it doesn't mean anything especially is wrong with you. You just happen to have an optical illusion.
Yeah, but most of the pilot sightings have not just been one pilot. You don't have two or three men sitting in the cockpit of a plane all seeing the same thing and all having hallucinations.
In addition, you've got a case like this. What was it?
And being told by the Air Force to follow them.
Well, it wasn't simply the crew, but about 13 passengers who also saw the same.
Well,
other cases where
we've had cases of reportings of something else that had nothing to do with flying saucers, and quite a long time before flying saucers, where somebody said, "Oh, look, did you see that?" And he said, "Yeah, it was a big green rocket." And the next fellow saw, sure, it was a green rocket, and had a red tail. The next fellow added something else onto it. By the time you're all done, everybody's seen the same thing.
Well, anyway, the point I'm going to make doesn't really have anything to do with the reliability of the reports. The point is that insofar as the public all over the world is concerned, if these things were stated to exist, what has been said to exist, reported to exist, and the public is not examining all these reports very carefully to scrutinize and screen them, is objects that behave more, whose performance is superior to that of Earth's aircraft. Now, if these are United States government devices, and if they are being used in some kind of a Cold War to influence and impress other nations, then what are we waiting for at present before we acknowledge that they are ours? Certainly, we can't deny that when the Russians sent up the first Sputnik, they scored a big propaganda victory, when they send up the second Sputnik, they scored a propaganda victory. And now that they have been the first to achieve escape velocity, they have scored still another propaganda victory. They've got a lead that we're going to have a hard time overcoming. All right. Now, if we have these things which are certainly associated with a remarkable performance in the public mind, true or false, I mean, it doesn't matter. This is what the public thinks about it. As far as propaganda value is concerned, now would be the time to say that these are ours. And how much longer are we going to wait? What rainy day are we waiting for to reveal the fact that these are ours? What good are they doing us compared to the fact that the good that they could do if we acknowledge that they were our weapons? We're going to be like a miser who dies of starvation on a mattress stuffed with dollar bills.
Well, I'm sure I don't know how much longer we're going to wait. I would go into a couple of your other points. The obvious fact is that the flying saucers are more advanced than conventional aircraft. The crux of the matter is how much more advanced, and that's and that's the absolute basis of my argument here. I think that when you screen out, or no, I won't say screen out, I would say if you could know the real details involved in some of these sightings that have been exaggerated, you would find that none of the authentic reports are that much further advanced than the crafts that we know about. And this isn't idle talk. It goes back to what I said before, but it's all been outlined in a couple of very good articles in my magazine by this gentleman named Justin Case about how people know they've seen something, and it's an unconventional object, and they just don't have the ability to describe the details accurately enough in so many cases. And it goes into psychology and all that sort of thing, fields which the general public isn't familiar with, and namely how mistaken a man can be. It's just like an automobile accident. As you know, people see it, they describe it differently. Some will see things that never happened there.
Yes, that's very true, but nevertheless the accident happens.
That's right, and the sightings happen, precisely. The sightings happen. There's a basis behind every sighting, even if it's a balloon or one of Dr. Menzel's mirages. Something was there. Very few of these ordinary citizens make up the whole thing. There's no reason for them to.
Well, let's not talk about the ordinary citizens. Let's talk about rocket engineers. Let's talk about meteorologists. Let's talk about balloon experts who know what these things are and can identify them.
Has anybody ever seen one from a telescope? You know, one of those large telescopes, or the Mount Palomar or something?
Well, we don't know this, but it wouldn't be very strange if they had.
I don't know.
These telescopes.
You're dealing with a 200-inch telescope.
Well, I thought they have an electronic one, is it?
Out in space that we can get a...
I see.
They are focused to register or record light waves billions of light years away.
Let me ask you a question. Is about if you said what the American Air Force is doing. I mean, how it's bungling an investigation. I think would be putting it mildly. What about there must be sightings in other countries. What are these other countries doing about it, their official agencies?
Well, there are they figure ranges 15, 16, 17 other countries. I don't know what the count is just now. Do you, Jim?
No.
How many countries have an official investigations going on? And there's only one country that has taken at all publicity-minded attitude towards it. That isn't the word I want. That has come out, in which the Air Force officials have come out frankly and said, look, these things we saw these things, they've been seen, they behave very peculiarly, they're very strange, we have no notion what they are. That is Brazil, and even in Brazil they are less outspoken, less candid about it than they used to be. Without exception, all the other countries that have started investigating these things have put the investigations under wraps. I believe I'm correct on that, Jim, am I not?
I think that's about right.
I don't know of any country that has made public, as a routine matter, its investigations.
Well, it wasn't. It was a public statement on the part of Air Marshal Field, Air Marshal.
Dowding.
Dowding. He said that it was his opinion that they were extraterrestrial and that they were being guided by intelligent beings. This was the head of the Air Force, the Royal Air Force.
But that's I might add.
He made that as a representative of the organization itself.
But I mean, here's a man that you couldn't go any higher in the Royal Air Force.
But I'd like to say, however, that that's an unfortunate choice there because he also made statements that he believes in fairies, that he believes in spiritualism, that he believes in just about everything. And lots of the people that might go along with him on the first thing certainly wouldn't go along with him on the other things.
Well, can you refute fairies just because you haven't seen them?
Well, I'm not going to refute fairies right off the bat here, but I would say that this is an example of a man speaking out of his field. The man is speaking out of his field. That's the whole point.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have in front of me a clipping from a newspaper dated January 4th, 1959. The U.S. will outstrip Russia and the world in the next few months with a sensational series of space flights. The first 3 trips will make large-type headlines when monkeys are sent into orbit and brought back alive and unharmed. But as we read this news with awe, the scientists will be smiling to themselves, for they have a real earth-shaker tucked away in hidden laboratories. I can now reveal that this is a gigantic moon rocket that will hold 6 men and hundreds of scientific instruments. And before this year is out, the 6 men will be broadcasting. Just let me read this. These 6 men will be broadcasting back to the Earth their first news of what it is like to land on the moon. Now, their reports will be as sensational as the landing, for they will find strange creatures and plant life living on the moon's craggy surface. These creatures, like the tremendous dinosaurs of prehistoric times, will be found deep in the heart of fantastic underground caves that riddle the mountains on the moon. From Earth, the scientists will be ordered to keep clear of the moon monsters in case they attack and damage the specially sealed rocket. Quoted from was published in this past Sunday's New York Enquirer. I think Mr. Criswell is responsible for it. Here's another little point here that I possibly forgot. If the rocket's 12-foot thick casing were damaged, the 6 volunteer scientists would die at once on the moon's deadly atmosphere. Anybody have any comment?
Yes, I'd like to comment. Mr. Criswell had a column in, you know what magazine it was, called Criswell Predicts. He ran it for years.
Wasn't it the same newspaper?
Well, maybe it was, but I'm thinking one of the magazines. I think it was one of Ray Palmer's magazines.
Oh, that's possible.
And in which every month he made quite a number of predictions, and I recently had occasion to look at some back issues, and I read with extreme amusement some of the things that he had predicted for 1957 and 1958, which certainly never came true, and I suspect that if anyone tabulated his prophecies and how many of them have been fulfilled, it would come out to something like 5%.
Well, I heard that he was 98% right 10% of the time. Isn't that how it is?
Well, I remember there was one thing that that said that somebody like Marilyn Monroe was going to be elected president of the United States in 1956.
I'm for that.
Remember? Well, maybe it's a good idea at that, but nevertheless, it didn't happen, and it was about that wild-eyed.
And then I would vote.
You mean you wouldn't vote for George Van
I
Tassel?
haven't voted in the last 4 years yet.
Not for George Van Tassel?
Oh, yes, he's still a candidate. Is he still in the running? Has he...
He will accept a draft, I think is the way he phrased it when he was here last time.
Is he on the ballot? I don't suppose. No, he's just a write-in in California.
In California, he may be on the ballot. But it won't be till 1960. There's a good chance he'll be on the ballot in California. I don't think he'll make it in any other state, but in California, they possibly need 50,000 signatures or something on the petition. This would be pretty easy to get with him because he has a good following.
Oh, yeah, he certainly does.
Now, Jim, I want to go back to your government devices theory, U.S. government devices theory. I will accept, for the purpose of this argument, your assumption that all of the very high speeds and high maneuvers, and extreme maneuvers, are exaggerations or misinterpretations. Only for the sake of this particular point.
Only the huge sizes and the high speeds. I'll accept the maneuvers, not the sizes of a half a mile and a mile, and not the speeds of 25,000 miles an hour.
Well, why would you accept that and not the other?
Well, because in the first place, you have only a few cases of these tremendous sizes and speeds. They're in doubt. They are fantastic enough so that if any one of them could be proven absolutely true, then it would probably have to be a case of visitation from another planet. But there again, it's not a question of just this one thing bothering me. It's the sum total of the evidence. The rest of the evidence doesn't point to a visitation from another planet. And this being the only contrary evidence and not having been proven and having much to say against it, which, as I say, has been pointed out in detail by several different writers, Dr. Davison and Justin Case and others, I don't feel obliged to accept these particular sightings.
Well, don't accept even the maneuvers. I'll relinquish even the maneuvers. I still want to know how you explain the fact that these United States government devices have been seen over every country in the world, or reported over every country in the world. What are we doing? Flying things all over the globe.
Breaking security regulations and everything.
Oh, I wouldn't know if they were all ours or not, and I don't know if they've been seen over absolutely every area of the world. They've been seen over populated areas, in Europe, here, a little bit in Africa,
South America, Australia.
But you find
countries, just about every country in the world.
But you find them mostly in advanced countries.
Well,
right?
you get more reports over advanced countries because you have a communication system. You have radio and you have newspapers. Naturally, in Tibet, you would, if you're, no matter how many times you've seen in Tibet, you wouldn't get many reports. But they've certainly been seen over enough countries to make you wonder what the United States government is doing.
You see, I always run into trouble on this subject because I have some information and some ideas on it which I don't feel at liberty to discuss, and I hate to say that because it sounds like an easy way out, but it just keeps me from making my case as coherent as I would otherwise be able to make it. That's about all I can say.
Well, I can understand that, and I don't think this is the same sort of striptease act that the Space Brothers
I mean, I didn't want to even say that because it sounds bad, but I finally had to.
But you must recognize that to anyone who lacks this information that you have, it seems like extremely peculiar behavior when we take such enormous precautions to protect certain information, and then we send these things all over the world where you can't be sure whether some
Bill, aren't you aware that we're
photographer...
pretty stupid as a country, frankly?
What?
Aren't you pretty aware that we're pretty stupid as a country?
Well, yes, I am, but
Our diplomatic relations are the worst ever.
Stupidity over such a long period of time and in such huge doses that it passes just normal, run-of-the-mill standard operating procedures to fit it.
No, it's quite possible that the flying saucers, if they are actually American planes, might be under the guidance of the State Department, which would then explain why we are messing up everything, possibly.
Well, Isabel, I still say that the day that we really have space visitors, I think we'll all know about it. I think it'll be flashed all over the world. I don't think there'll be any doubt, any guessing, any hazy photographs. I don't think there'll be any question about it. It'll be a world-shaking event.
I think they already know it, and they have known it for many years, and they're still withholding it.
WOR Radio, your station in New York, on this planet, the Earth.
Are you sure?
I'm not sure of anything, believe me, Jim.
I tell you, we had a United Nations committee, three-man committee that went through 58 of the United Nations this last year, about from February through May. Covered 58 of the nations. And the conclusion that was arrived at was that all the delegates that were talked to were of the opinion that there were such things as flying saucers, but they couldn't come out officially and say anything about it. In fact, we got many stories from the Japanese ambassador and quite a few of the others that came out and told actual sightings that they'd had themselves, and then at the end of it said, we don't believe in it officially.
Well, there again, you have a case of the same sort of thing. Individuals have made sightings who are impressed with their own sightings, and that makes them interested in the subject. But because a man is an ambassador, doesn't mean that he's infallible and certainly not on a subject that's out of his domain. I mean, I'm glad they're interested. It just gets down to the same point as we were discussing before about Kehoe's board of directors. It's interesting, it's good, it's nice that people of standing are interested in the subject or have seen something or want to know more about it. But beyond that, it doesn't mean an awful lot.
Well, Jim, you could rule out anybody's testimony in that case.
Okay.
Except
No,
If the President of the United States...
Very good, very good. That's the perfect way to do it. That's the way we should do it. Rule out everybody except your own.
That's what I do.
I
I know
prefer...
they're there, and I'm not going to prove it to anybody.
I prefer Mrs. Fitzgerald to any of these statesmen and military men who haven't seen anything but just have some opinion on the
And of course,
subject.
some of these people have seen something, you know. Some of the Board of Governors have seen it.
Seen what?
Psychiatrist.
Unidentified flying objects.
Oh, well, this means nothing, Isabel. Something that you can't identify. I don't doubt that. I saw possibly 3 or 4 things today that I can't identify, but I don't
There
think
was an apparition. There was an apparition in green in the control room before. Did you see that, John?
Well, no,
A lot of weird things going on there.
This is all right, but the point that Jim was making was that the Board of Governors carried little weight with him because they hadn't actually reported anything. Well, some of them have reported something. Whatever it was, they have reported something. So
Is this a
seems to
secret?
me, what?
Is this a secret, or do we all know it? I'm a member of NICAP. I don't know of anything.
Well, I'm saying the Board of Governors. He's being particularly the Board of Governors. You see, he's trying to knock down the importance of their support of this subject.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, "Well, I prefer Mrs. Fitzgerald as the housewife in Sheffield."
Well, only because she saw a thing 10 or 20 feet away, and she is one of the few that I'd like to talk to, and I think she really has some clue about what she saw. She saw details. She saw, as I recall, little propellers or some, am I wrong now? Little protrusions of some sort, what type of protrusions were they?
I think it was just a bulge on top.
No, there were little things around the edge doing something peculiar. I mean, detail.
Jim, you're wasting a terrible lot of time.
One of the most detailed shows is I've heard a 2.5-hour tape on the Mitchell sisters. And if you want detail, this really goes in.
Who are the Mitchell
These are
sisters?
these two sisters that for the last 10 years they've been having alleged contacts, if you want to call it that. I neither accept it or reject it because I don't know them. I don't know the story or anything else. But one of them was taken up to a mothership by a scout ship, and they were on the ship, and it's what you would call a fantastic story.
Well, that's a very good
No,
point.
I'm saying what people would call to me, it's not fantastic.
Now,
I think, wait a minute, Jim, I think you're making a terrible mistake. You're talking about Mrs. Fitzgerald and so on, she's not here, but you're sitting next to a man who had 12 sightings. And as a good reporter, I think it is only fair that you make a report to your magazine on what you think of Doug's sightings, for example. I mean, how do you... seriously, when you go to see somebody and you want to talk to them about the sightings, you're trying to check up on them, I'd like to know what questions you ask to prove to your own mind or satisfaction. What would you ask Doug? I mean, you don't have to ask Doug.
No, I mean, your question is now, how would I conduct an interview to find out what a person is saying?
You obviously are going to make up your mind at the end of this interview whether or not this person saw what you thought might have been a flying saucer.
Well, let me give you one factor, just to go back to the other point a minute. If now Mrs. Fitzgerald were suddenly to get religion or something, or to start to write books, give lectures on philosophy or what she's learned, or she remembers now later that she had some message while she had this sighting and so on. If all this were to occur, then I would take back what I've said about her sighting, and I wouldn't feel it very important anymore.
Well,
and that applies to these two sisters. They sound like they've been doing too much for too long. I don't know them either, but...
Well, let's say... I take it you're not a spiritual.